63 years ago, a toddler vanished from Washington Park in Springfield, Illinois, on a peaceful morning, leaving behind an empty stroller and a panicked mother screaming for help in the middle of a crowd. Authorities suspected a strange woman who had appeared near the scene, but with no body, no evidence, and the case quickly went cold. Yet, for all the long years that followed, that mother never gave up hope, clinging to the slim chance that her son was still alive somewhere. Then one day, more than half a century later, a random DNA match breathed new life into what everyone thought was a forgotten case, revealing a secret that stunned the entire Illinois investigative community and turned everything they thought they knew upside down. Before we dive deep into this shocking story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and if you love cold cases that get solved after decades, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. October 1962. Springfield, Illinois was still a quiet Midwestern town where people left their doors unlocked and knew every neighbor by name. Red brick houses lined streets covered in golden leaves, American flags flew in front yards, and old Ford and Chevrolet models were neatly parked along the curbs. The small city moved to the familiar post-war American rhythm, orderly, stable, and trusting. In the South Side neighborhood, the Bennett family lived in a single-story light blue house with a small wooden porch overlooking a flower bed of daisies. Thomas Bennett, an electrical engineer for the railroad, was a quiet, punctual man who left the house every morning before 8. Evelyn Bennett, 28, a former preschool teacher, had quit her job to care for their first child. Little Michael had just turned 13 months old, with curly brown hair and bright, curious eyes. Every Saturday morning while Thomas got ready for work, Evelyn would buckle Michael into the stroller, grab his bottle and the blanket embroidered with the letter M, and walk the few blocks to Washington Park. It was a routine the whole neighborhood had grown used to seeing, a young mother strolling slowly under the elm trees, occasionally stopping to greet a neighbor or tuck the blanket around her son. That morning the sky was clear, a light breeze blew, and sunlight glittered on the calm lake. The park was nearly empty, just a few elderly walkers and a group of kids throwing a ball on the far lawn. Evelyn stopped at the wooden bench by the path and parked the stroller right beside her. While she wiped dust off the handle with a cloth, a strange woman walked past. She wore a light green coat and a bright-colored headscarf that partly shaded her face. She walked slowly, her eyes lingering on the baby for a few seconds before giving a faint smile. Evelyn smiled politely back, assuming it was just a passerby admiring the child, something that happened all the time at the park. The woman kept walking toward the east parking lot and soon disappeared behind the trees. Evelyn glanced after her for a moment, then thought nothing more of it. When the wind picked up, she decided to head home early before lunch. She bent down to check on Michael and realized she had forgotten his light jacket and bottle at home. The house was only a few blocks away. She hesitated for a second, then decided to run back quickly and leave the stroller under the tree where Michael was still sound asleep. She hurried down the path, shielding her eyes from the sun, thinking she'd be back in minutes. When she returned, the space in front of the bench was empty. The stroller was tilted to one side, the blanket on the ground. Evelyn froze, looked around, and called Michael's name. No answer. She ran up and down the paths, searched every corner of the park, and asked everyone nearby. An older woman said she had seen someone carrying a baby toward the parking lot, assuming it was a family member. Evelyn stood paralyzed as an icy chill ran down her spine. She sprinted to the parking area, scanning every direction, only seeing cars pulling away with engines roaring. She ran back to the lake, searched under the trees, calling until her voice gave out. A few strangers in the park started helping, fanning out along the paths and lakeside, but found nothing. Sweat and tears mixed on her face. She was nearly delirious. Leaving the stroller behind, she ran straight home, still clutching Michael's little embroidered blanket. When Thomas heard his wife say the baby was gone, he dropped everything at work and sped home. The couple rushed back out, asking every passerby, peering into every parked car near the park. No one knew anything. No one had seen anything concrete beyond the vague story of the woman in the green coat. They searched in desperation, calling their son's name into the empty air. When all efforts proved useless, Evelyn let go of the railing, turned to her husband with a trembling voice, and told him to call the police. As soon as the call reached dispatch, 2 Springfield police patrol cars were sent immediately to Washington Park. By the time they arrived, dozens of people had already gathered near the lake: neighbors, walkers, a few park employees. Evelyn sat slumped on the bench, still clutching the little blanket, her face ashen and speechless. Lieutenant Frank Delaney, in charge of the morning shift, quickly ordered the scene preserved and had civilians moved away from the area around the bench where the stroller was found. He set up a 20-meter cordon, called in the crime scene unit, and had the stroller secured. Thomas Bennett gave a brief statement. The child had been missing less than 30 minutes. No cries, no signs of a struggle. Delaney took detailed notes and ordered photos of the entire area and the collection of anything that might be relevant. 2 other officers canvassed the park and began recording information on vehicles that had left the east lot between 11 a.m. and noon. The stroller was carefully examined. One front wheel had mud of a different type than the soil on the paved paths. The blanket was pulled to one side, and a few short blonde hairs were caught on the leather strap. Technicians wearing gloves cut the hairs, placed them in numbered evidence bags, and sealed them on site. Under the remaining blanket there was no blood, and no signs of a struggle. Delaney ordered the scene report to document everything: bench location, wind direction, temperature, ground surface condition. A hand-drawn map was made marking every piece of evidence. Meanwhile, another team took witness statements from people in the area. Mrs. Langford, who lived near the park, said she saw a young woman with blonde hair wearing a light green coat, carrying a baby toward the east parking lot, but couldn't remember the face clearly. A man feeding pigeons also reported seeing a light-colored Chevrolet, possibly a 1960 or 1961 model, leave the area, though he didn't note the license plate. The statements overlapped on timing, but differed on the woman's description. Some said thin, others said heavier. Delaney recorded everything, assuming most witnesses had only caught a glimpse. He ordered a check of all light-colored Chevrolet registrations within a 50-mile radius and sent teletypes to highway patrol posts. A K-9 unit was brought in and tracked the scent from the blanket around the lake, but the trail ended at the East Park gate leading to Highway 4. Along the exit path, officers found faint tire tracks that stopped briefly before turning onto the main road. The mud color matched what was on the stroller wheel. Soil samples were collected and sealed with the other evidence. Every action was logged according to procedure. Scene documentation began 12:27 p.m. Victim, Michael Bennett, male, 13 months. Missing from Washington Park. Status unknown. Initial assumption, abduction. Delaney ordered panoramic photos before dark and all samples stored in a mobile refrigerator unit. He spoke again with Thomas and Evelyn, asking for a description of Michael's clothing, exact departure time from home, and everything they had brought. Evelyn answered in broken sentences. Michael wore a light gray sweater, beige pants, white socks. The blanket had an embroidered Emma Charles. Thomas added that the boy couldn't walk yet and only babbled a few sounds. Delaney noted this carefully. It limited the search radius. The child couldn't have left on his own. He asked park staff for the parking lot entry-exit log and contacted the nearest toll booth for traffic camera photos, mostly periodic still images at the time. By early afternoon, the cordon was expanded to 2 adjacent neighborhoods. Police went door to door asking questions. A gas station attendant more than a mile away reported seeing a light-colored Chevrolet pull in for gas with a young woman holding a small child, but he didn't recall the plate. This was logged as a possible lead. Delaney created an evidence summary board: #01 hair sample, #02 mud from stroller wheel, #03 embroidered blanket, #04 Mrs. Langford statement, #05 gas station attendant statement. By end of day, all evidence was sealed per protocol and transferred to the central lab in Springfield. The case was officially opened as #62-1047, classified missing child, possible abduction. Delaney's final note read, "Clean scene, indications of premeditated act, suspect likely a stranger with a plan. Victim likely removed from area by motor vehicle." After signing, he ordered the search to continue through the night and sent an urgent alert to the FBI's Chicago field office in case the case crossed state lines. Under the floodlights, the yellow cordon tape fluttered gently in the wind, marking the starting point of a case no one in Springfield imagined would haunt them for decades to come. The next morning, while thin mist still clung to the lake, the crime scene team returned to Washington Park to finish surveying the terrain. Lieutenant Delaney and two forensic specialists brought measuring tools, markers, and a large format camera. They started at the bench, where Evelyn discovered the empty stroller, and worked outward in a 15-meter radius. The ground was dry, grass slightly flattened in streaks, no signs of struggle or dropped personal items. This suggested the child was lifted gently without resistance, or the perpetrator acted fast enough to avoid noise. Technicians crawled on the ground, examining every blade of grass under angled light for footprints, fibers, or cigarette butts. Only overlapping prints from civilians and yesterday's officers, impossible to separate. They moved to the dirt path leading east to the parking lot and Highway 4. Here the tire tracks were clearer on the damp soil, two short parallel marks, then a sharp turn toward the gate. Measurements confirmed a mid-size vehicle, matching 1960-61 Chevrolet models. The brief stop lasted only seconds, just long enough for someone to open a door, place something on the back seat, and drive off. No footprints beside the tracks meant the action happened right at the car's edge, or was obliterated by the tires. Delaney ordered close-up photos and took soil samples to compare with the stroller mud. Lab results later confirmed identical mineral composition and moisture, strengthening the theory that the car had stopped exactly there. Back at the lake, he had a large-scale diagram drawn, marking the bench, stroller position, wind direction, distance to the exit, and the time Evelyn was away. According to Evelyn, she was gone no more than 5 minutes. According to Mrs. Langford, about 10 minutes after seeing Evelyn leave, she saw the strange woman carrying the baby away. Comparing statements and log times, Delaney identified an unexplained 6 to 8 minute window, enough for someone with a vehicle to approach, act, and leave unnoticed. He double-checked the crime scene camera timestamps to ensure no more than 2-minute error. The final timeline was 10:05. Evelyn leaves the bench, 10:10. Suspect approaches 10:13. Leaves park via East Gate 10:15. Mrs. Langford sees final movement. This window fell exactly during the park's quietest period, a perfect gap for a planned abduction. Delaney noted the route led to Highway 4 toward Peoria, a lightly patrolled road that easily blended with commercial traffic. He requested traffic camera stills from the nearest intersection, even though they were only hourly photos. When the team finished measuring, the area was metal detected for dropped items, nothing found. The scene report concluded, no struggle, no cries, no witnesses heard an engine near the lake. Only a chain of tire tracks leading to the main road. Based on that, Delaney's preliminary conclusion was a carefully planned kidnapping by someone familiar with the park's layout, who chose the emptiest moment and escaped quickly. No evidence suggested an impulsive crime. He signed the supplemental report, sent all photos and samples to the lab, and ordered a map of probable escape routes within 10 minutes of leaving the park. From the old bench to the strange tire tracks to the East Gate, the chain of evidence formed a short but precise journey. When the team left, only faint tire marks remained in the sun, the sole proof that a stranger had passed through and left behind a 6 to 8 minute void that the entire investigation would spend decades trying to explain. For the next 3 days after completing the scene survey, the Springfield Police Department focused all manpower on collecting and cross-referencing witness statements. A list was compiled of 12 people present in Washington Park on the morning of October 13th, including maintenance workers, 2 dog walkers, a group of high school volunteers, and nearby residents. Each was brought to headquarters for individual taped interviews and signed statements. Mrs. Langford, 61, repeated her initial account, a young blonde woman in a light green coat, carrying a baby from the lakeside bench area toward the east parking lot. She was about 30 meters away, heard no conversation, remembered the woman as average height, walking quickly, left hand carrying a bag, right arm holding the baby close to her chest. When shown coat color samples, she picked one closest to mint green. Second key witness Peter Dunn, 45, feeding pigeons nearly 100 meters away, saw the same thing but described the woman as thinner, with slightly wavy blonde hair, and the child wrapped in a light-colored blanket. He also recalled hearing an engine start shortly after, but didn't see the car leave. These 2 statements were deemed most reliable because their observation times fell within the 10:10-10:15 window established by the crime scene timeline. Other witnesses offered fragmented details. 2 students saw a woman in a light coat sitting near the lake bench about half an hour earlier. A dog walker heard a brief child's cry that suddenly stopped. A park employee thought the woman might have been Evelyn's friend because they seemed to be chatting naturally. That last detail immediately caught Lieutenant Delaney's attention. He had Evelyn brought in again to rule out an acquaintance. In the interview room, eyes swollen from sleeplessness, Evelyn slowly insisted she did not know anyone matching the description and had never met a blonde woman at the park. Asked about old friends or former colleagues possibly visiting, she shook her head. She had stayed home since quitting teaching and rarely socialized. Police showed her the composite sketch based on witness descriptions. She studied it for a long time but recognized no one. The 2-hour interview documented every minute of her morning when she left home, the route to the park, everyone she greeted, and the moment she discovered Michael missing. Her account aligned perfectly with her husband's and surrounding witnesses, no significant contradictions. However, once news of the case spread, public speculation took a different turn. The Springfield Daily ran a headline: "The mysterious disappearance of a little boy, what does the mother say?" alongside a photo of Evelyn sitting blankly on her porch. Some readers wrote letters claiming her initial interview reaction seemed too calm. Rumors that the mother knows more than she's saying spread quickly through the small community. Though Delaney did not believe that angle, he still noted in the file, "Consider possible family involvement, verify alibis fully." Officers checked Thomas Bennett's work schedule. He had been at the rail yard all morning, confirmed by multiple coworkers. The solid alibi quickly eliminated that line of inquiry, but public pressure forced police to be extra cautious in every report. Subsequent interviews focused on reconstructing the suspect's movements. Investigators had every witness mark their exact position on a park map, creating a movement diagram of the woman in the green coat. Data showed a linear path appearing near the lake, brief stop at the bench, then exiting via the east path. No sign of a second person. From this diagram, Delaney concluded the suspect acted alone with a vehicle waiting near the gate. The third-day summary report stated, "Witnesses confirm presence of unidentified woman, behavior proactive and not coincidental. Victim removed in very short window without resistance. No evidence of family involvement." The chief ordered expanded searches, focusing on the light-colored suspect vehicle. Yet while investigators chased the Chevrolet lead, newspapers kept emphasizing the mother angle, turning the story in the public eye from a simple missing child case into a family tragedy. Unfounded rumors began to overshadow official information, and even in its earliest days, the case was already colored by suspicion and heavy public pressure on the very people who had been victimized. After nearly a week of canvassing witnesses and gathering information, the investigation began to focus increasingly on the vehicle seen leaving the park on the morning of the disappearance. Lieutenant Delaney ordered the administrative division to compile a complete list of all Chevrolet vehicles from the 1960 and 1961 model years registered within a 60-mile radius of Springfield. More than 250 records were pulled from the Illinois Department of Transportation database, detailing the owner's name, address, paint color, chassis number, and insurance status. The investigative team was divided into 3 groups, systematically contacting each owner to verify their whereabouts on October 13th. The cross-checking process stretched over several days, gradually eliminating vehicles that did not match the color or had been sold before the date of the crime. By the 8th day, the list had been narrowed down to 11 light-colored Chevrolets still in circulation, among them one registered in Peoria, nearly 80 kilometers from Springfield, owned by Clara Whitmore. Administrative records showed she was a nurse at Peoria Memorial Hospital, 27 years old, single, and had moved to her current address at the beginning of 1961. This timeline caught Delaney's attention because the attached personnel file included a note about a 3-month leave of absence for personal reasons in mid-1961. He requested verification of the reason, and the hospital confirmed that Clara had suffered a miscarriage at 8 weeks, was unmarried, had returned to work afterward, but rarely socialized with colleagues. Her vehicle insurance records matched the witness description, a cream-colored Chevrolet, 2-door license plate, beginning with the letter H, re-registered in August 1962. To avoid tipping her off, the team decided to gather intelligence discreetly before making direct contact. 2 officers were sent to Peoria and observed that Clara's apartment was on the ground floor of a quiet 3-story residential building with a private garage in the back. On the morning they arrived, the cream Chevrolet was parked right in front, its paint faded, and the front wheel wells caked with dark brown mud. They photographed the license plate and wired the image back to Springfield for confirmation. It matched perfectly. Delaney requested a formal warrant for questioning from the local court and coordinated with Peoria police to approach the owner. That same afternoon, 3 officers knocked on apartment 3B. Clara Whitmore answered the door, small frame, light blonde hair, wearing a wrinkled nurse's uniform. She appeared calm and answered questions briefly. When asked about her schedule on October 13th, Clara said she had worked the morning shift and rested at home during her break. However, when investigators asked the hospital to confirm, the personnel office reported that she had swapped shifts with a colleague that day and had not actually been at work. This discrepancy caused her statement to be flagged as inconsistent. Police requested to inspect the vehicle. She reluctantly agreed. The interior was spotless, but the trunk showed old scratches and peeling paint. No suspicious items were found. They collected mud samples from the undercarriage for analysis. When asked if she had ever been to Springfield, Clara replied that she had passed through a few times to visit friends, but could not recall specific dates. She showed no signs of panic, yet her expression changed noticeably at the mention of Washington Park. Delaney noted this reaction in detail. After leaving the apartment, he ordered a review of Clara's medical records, confirming the miscarriage and her subsequent psychological state. Her former treating physician described prolonged depression, chronic insomnia, and an obsession with wanting the baby back. This led Delaney to believe Clara fit the profile of a maternal abductor previously outlined in FBI files, women who had lost a child and acted out of emotional compulsion rather than material gain. All information was compiled into a 7-page report submitted to the sheriff's office. The conclusion read, cream-colored Chevrolet plate H4762, owner Clara Whitmore, nurse at Peoria Memorial Hospital. History of miscarriage, lives alone, alibi unverified. Designated subject of interest. Delaney ordered continued silent surveillance and no press disclosure. He believed that if Clara was involved, she might reveal further clues in the coming days. Identifying the vehicle owner had significantly narrowed the investigation, but it also opened a new direction. The abduction might not have been a spontaneous act by a stranger, but the calculated plan of someone carrying old grief, lucid enough to cover her tracks and desperate enough to do the unthinkable. The following week, when forensic analysis of the mud samples taken from underneath Clara Whitmore's Chevrolet showed mineral composition consistent with soil from the Washington Park area. Lieutenant Delaney decided to return the team to Peoria for direct verification. The goal was to establish Clara's movements between October 12 and 15, the exact window of Michael Bennett's disappearance. In the residential complex where Clara lived, investigators went door to door. Hazel Morgan, who lived upstairs, stated that for 3 days in mid-October, the downstairs apartment had been a day almost empty, doors locked. But on the morning of the 15th, she saw Clara return by taxi, carrying a small baby wrapped in a light-colored blanket. She remembered it clearly because she assumed Clara had given birth without anyone knowing. When pressed for details, Hazel said she heard faint crying from the apartment that night, then nothing. Another neighbor, Jerome Blake, confirmed he saw Clara drive the Chevrolet out of the lot on the morning of the 12th and not return for 3 days. These statements align perfectly with the crime's timeline. Delaney requested cross-checking of fuel receipts around Peoria to trace the car, but limited records yielded nothing conclusive. The next day, the team visited the hospital where Clara worked and confirmed she had been absent without leave on the 13th. When invited to the station for formal questioning, Clara arrived in simple office attire, outwardly calm but with tired eyes. She completely denied leaving Peoria, claiming she had stayed home resting and feeling unwell, and suggested the neighbors were mistaken. When asked about the baby others had seen, Clara insisted there was never any child, and explained that the neighbors might have seen her carrying laundry or folding blankets. Delaney demanded proof of her alibi, someone who could confirm she was home, but Clara only named a colleague, saying they had spoken briefly by phone on the 13th. When police contacted the colleague, she vaguely recalled the call happening sometime in the evening, but could not pinpoint the time. The ambiguity rendered Clara's statement unreliable. Investigators executed a court-ordered search of the apartment. It was clean and tidy, with no signs a child had ever been there. They checked closets, the bed, laundry area and trash, no infant items whatsoever, only a light-colored blanket hanging to dry, made of fabric that did not match the Bennett family's blanket. Forensic tests found no matching fibers or DNA. In the garage, the Chevrolet was re-examined under ultraviolet light for biological traces. Results were negative. No blood, no foreign fingerprints besides Clara's. When questioned again about her movements during those days, Clara repeated that she had stayed home, read books, rested, and never left Peoria. Her consistent demeanor and lack of excessive stress made it difficult for Delaney to detect deception. He ordered continued covert surveillance rather than arrest, as probable cause for charges was still lacking. The team remained in Peoria for 3 days, secretly monitoring apartment 3B. Clara left for work on schedule, made no unusual contacts, and displayed no abnormal behavior. A hospital coworker mentioned she had become quieter lately, often sat alone after shifts, and sometimes stared at pictures of babies in magazines, but that alone was not evidence. Delaney felt the trail going cold. No physical evidence, no new witnesses, only conflicting statements, and an unexplained gap in time. Before leaving Peoria, he visited Hazel Morgan one last time to assess the reliability of her account. She stood firmly by her observation of the baby, emphasizing the light blanket and how tightly Clara held it, saying, "There's no mistaking it. I saw it clearly from my window." Delaney noted it, but knew such testimony carried little legal weight without corroborating physical proof. He left the building at dusk, feeling everything slipping out of reach. When the report reached Springfield, the final line read, "Clara Whitmore, nurse, resident of Peoria. Witnesses confirm she was away during the crime window and returned carrying an unidentified infant. Alibi uncertain. No physical evidence of abduction recovered. Insufficient grounds for prosecution." The supplemental file was attached to case hash 62-1047, along with photos of the apartment, garage and interrogation reports. Delaney closed the folder, marked it yellow, wrote pending verification, subject under surveillance on the cover, and set it on his desk, his gaze lingering on the name Clara Whitmore, a woman he could neither prove innocent nor charge, in a missing child case, slowly sliding into the shadows of silence and absent evidence. After the report on Clara Whitmore was sent to Springfield, but lacked sufficient legal grounds for prosecution, Lieutenant Delaney proposed transferring the file to federal level to expand the search beyond Illinois. On October 27, the FBI office in Chicago officially took over the case, classifying it child abduction, interstate possibility. A joint task force with the Springfield Police Department was formed, focusing on three main avenues: checking all adoption records statewide, reviewing highway traffic data, and tracing the suspect Chevrolet along major interstates. At FBI Chicago headquarters, administrative staff compiled every adoption record from September through December 1962. None involved a child with the last name Bennett or originated from the Springfield area. All legal adoptions were properly certified by the state family court, and none were filed by anyone named Clara Whitmore. This completely ruled out the possibility of a lawful adoption if Clara indeed had the child after the disappearance. At the same time, the Illinois Department of Transportation was asked to provide records of vehicles passing toll booths on routes 4 and 55 between October 13 and 15. Grainy black and white photographs taken by automatic cameras were examined frame by frame. One image captured at a checkpoint near the town of Lincoln showed a light-colored Chevrolet heading north at 10:45 a.m. on the 13th in the direction of Peoria. The license plate was illegible, but the front-end shape and headlight placement matched Clara's car exactly. Due to poor quality, the driver could not be identified, yet the photo was included in the report as a possible sighting. The Bureau also requested verification of all births of infants in the final 3 months of 1962 at hospitals around Peoria, Bloomington, and St. Louis. No records matched Michael Bennett's description or timeline. Some home births lacked hospital documentation, but had local witnesses or midwife certifications, except for one unusual filing in Peoria in November 1962 for a child named Mark Whitmore. Mother listed as Clara Whitmore, born at home, father unlisted. The certificate bore a faint stamp and no court registration number. The FBI immediately forwarded a copy to Delaney. When cross-referenced with Peoria civil records, the name Mark Whitmore first appeared in 1963, but no matching medical or birth records existed. Administrative irregularities were noted, though not yet sufficient for charges pending further verification. Back in Springfield, Delaney met with 2 FBI agents specializing in psychological profiling and criminal behavior records. They reviewed the entire case timeline, from the disappearance to statements surrounding Clara. The behavioral report drafted by the federal team concluded that the crime was unlikely motivated by ransom or personal grudge, and most closely resembled maternal abduction, impulsive emotional kidnapping, typically committed by women who had lost a child or suffered reproductive trauma. The profile described perpetrators acting alone, with simple but precise planning, randomly selecting a victim of similar age to the child they lost, then fleeing immediately and raising the child as their own. This matched Clara Whitmore's medical history, miscarriage in 1961, solitary lifestyle, and withdrawn demeanor. The FBI also checked whether Clara had any relatives or friends who might have assisted her after the loss. Results showed no close family, only a former colleague named Marjorie Heller, who visited once in the hospital in 1961 and had no further contact. When federal agents interviewed Clara's past co-workers, many described her as sensitive to crying babies and said she avoided the maternity ward. One recalled that a few weeks before the Springfield disappearance, Clara had carried a magazine with baby photos and said, "One day I'll have one again." All these notes were added as a psychological appendix to case #62-1047. Though no direct evidence existed, the convergence of behavior, timing, and vehicle made Clara the primary suspect. Delaney submitted the consolidated report to the sheriff and the FBI liaison in Chicago, recommending continued surveillance. However, legal counsel warned that all monitoring must remain covert due to lack of concrete proof of criminality. The interim federal summary stated No lawful adoption paperwork found, no evidence of commercial or organized activity. Behavior consistent with maternal abduction, personal, emotional motive. Subject, Clara Whitmore. Female, 27. Peoria. Resident. Status, under federal observation. The documents were classified and returned to Springfield in early November. With FBI involvement, the case officially moved beyond a local investigation into the phase of federal oversight, where every piece of evidence required systematic confirmation, yet nothing was strong enough to turn suspicion into formal charges. Just as the file was being shuttled between Springfield and the FBI's Chicago office, an unexpected development threw the investigation off rhythm. On November 9th, the Bennett family received an unmarked envelope postmarked from Decatur, about 80 kilometers from Springfield. Inside was a folded sheet of paper with slanted, ballpoint-penned writing in blue ink. "The child is still alive. If you want him back, prepare $10,000, no police." Further instructions to follow. It was signed, "The Keeper of Michael." Thomas Bennett immediately brought the letter to the police department. Lieutenant Delaney sealed all information to prevent media leaks and contacted the FBI for handwriting analysis. The letter was sent to the Chicago Document Lab. Examiners determined the writing was shaky with uneven pressure, indicating deliberate disguise of normal handwriting. The paper was common office stock, bearing no clear fingerprints except Thomas's from opening the envelope. The postmark confirmed it was mailed from a public mailbox on Decatur's Main Street on the afternoon of the 8th. Delaney dispatched 2 investigators to Decatur to canvass the area and review nearby traffic cameras. A blurry image captured a tall man in a flat cap dropping the letter into the box, then driving off in a small pickup truck. The plate was unreadable. Police quietly circulated the description to shipping companies and gas stations. Meanwhile, the FBI set up a tapped phone line at the Bennett home in case the sender called. 3 days passed with no contact. On the morning of the 13th, a second letter arrived in the same handwriting, demanding the money be left behind the old movie theater in Springfield on Friday night. Delaney organized a covert stakeout, positioning officers around the area from afternoon onward. At exactly 8 p.m., a man appeared carrying a small bag, walking furtively. As he bent down to check the decoy envelope prepared by police, 3 officers moved in and arrested him. The suspect was Harold Klein, 38, an unemployed laborer from Springfield with prior petty theft convictions. At the station, Harold confessed he had read about the disappearance in the newspaper and thought the family would pay if given the chance. He took the name Michael from the articles and wrote the ransom notes for profit. Harold had never left Springfield and knew nothing of Clara Whitmore or anyone involved. Fingerprint comparison confirmed his prints on the envelopes. The fake extortion case was separated and prosecuted as fraud, while Harold was held pending trial. Although the opportunist was caught, the damage was significant. A precious week of the real investigation had been wasted on a dead-end lead, while the main case stagnated. Delaney noted internally that investigative efforts were temporarily derailed by unrelated extortion. He also warned subordinates that the incident could undermine public confidence if details leaked. Local papers, though not given specifics, sensed a story. The Springfield Chronicle reported that police are exploring possible financial motives in the disappearance, shifting public suspicion once more. While the FBI continued monitoring Clara Whitmore, Delaney had to hold press conferences denying rumors, insisting there is no evidence the Bennett family was targeted for ransom by the actual abductor. Inside the police conference room, the crime scene map and photos of the Chevrolet remained on the wall, but no new red pins had been added. Surveillance in Peoria was paused due to diverted resources. By the time the Harold Klein matter was resolved, the investigation was back to square one. Only now 2 more weeks had passed, and whoever was truly behind Michael Bennett's disappearance, if anyone, had been given ample time and distance to vanish, along with every trace. When the fake extortion case was closed and the Clara Whitmore file remained stalled, Lieutenant Delaney decided to re-examine all administrative records related to newborns in the Peoria area, hoping to find any anomaly that might connect to the missing baby. At that time, Illinois' civil registry system still operated in silos. Each county maintained its own birth, death, and marriage records separately, with no statewide interconnection or federal data sharing mechanism. Paper records were typed and manually filed in steel cabinets, organized by month rather than by district. Delaney sent an official request to the Peoria County Registrar's Office for a list of children born between September and December 1962, but because of the volume, the search had to be done by hand. An administrative clerk named Ruth Carroll, who was in charge of checking the files, reported back that there were nearly 300 birth records in that period, and nothing appeared unusual. However, among those records was a birth certificate filed on November 20, 1962, just over a month after the disappearance, listing the name Mark Whitmore, mother Clara Whitmore. Place of birth at home, no father listed, no physician's signature or hospital certification, only the county office stamp. Ruth glanced at it, but did not flag it, because the form was legally valid at the time for home births. She had no knowledge of the Bennett case, and had not been instructed to watch for anything related to a woman named Clara, since Springfield Police Department data was not automatically forwarded to civil offices outside the county. Under 1962 administrative procedure, only federal warrant criminal cases required cross-notification to civil agencies, and case hash 62-1047 remained local jurisdiction. Consequently, the Mark Whitmore certificate was routinely accepted, filed in the Peoria drawer, and entered into the November ledger. At the same time, Springfield police detectives continued searching for newborns matching Michael Bennett's description, but the lists they received from the State Board of Health included only hospital births, excluding home births. This data separation meant the Mark Whitmore record never reached the investigators. In its December report, the FBI also confirmed no suspicious new births had been detected, because it only screened medical system records. The disconnect between agencies inadvertently legitimized the existence of a child newly carrying the Whitmore surname. Years later, when archivists compared documents, they noticed that the ink used for the county seal on Clara's certificate differed from the standard administrative ink, and the seal imprint was slightly misaligned. But in 1962, the county office had no protocol for ink comparison or old seal verification, so no one questioned it. Hundreds of similar certificates were filed and stamped each month, and there was no legal requirement to verify the truthfulness of the information beyond the submitter's signature. That very lack of interconnection created a loophole no one noticed. When Delaney finally received the complete Peoria list in early December, Mark Whitmore was just one ordinary line among hundreds, and drew no attention because there was no alert flag attached. He underlined a few other single-mother entries, but skipped the Whitmore record, believing Clara had already been thoroughly checked. All circumstantial evidence remained at the level of suspicion, never reaching legal connectivity. The Springfield Police Department's 1962 year-end summary stated, "No children matching the victim's description located, no relevant medical or civil data." That seemingly routine sentence would later stand as proof that the system had missed the case from the very beginning. In the Peoria archives, the Mark Whitmore certificate was filed with the other November births under Code 1762P and remained untouched for years. When Delaney submitted his final report, he wrote in the Coordination Difficulties section, "Lack of linkage between administrative agencies represents the greatest obstacle. Verifying information across county lines takes weeks and is sometimes fruitless." He had no idea that among the hundreds of pale yellow typed birth records, one bore the name of the woman they had surveilled and the child the entire state was searching for. But no one had the tools or authority to connect those two lines of text, and that administrative void quietly allowed the Bennett case to slip away into a dead end. Not because of insufficient manpower or professional error, but because the data fragments were never joined in a system that had not yet been born. By early 1963, after nearly 4 months of investigation yielding no further usable evidence, the disappearance of baby Michael Bennett officially entered a state of impasse. The consolidated report from all cooperating units showed every avenue had been exhausted. Washington Park offered no further forensic value, old witnesses provided no new details. The mud and blonde hair samples could not be analyzed more deeply due to technical limitations, and Clara Whitmore, the only person remaining on the suspect list, stood by her statement with no incriminating evidence. Lieutenant Delaney held a final meeting with the investigative team to review the entire file and check for anything overlooked. They re-examined every theory: affection-motivated abduction, random kidnapping, concealed accident, but none had substantiation. The forensics lab reported no new biological traces. Administrative units had no further leads on the suspect vehicle, and the FBI, having completed its federal report, suspended assistance until fresh evidence emerged. In the internal minutes, Delaney wrote, "No additional physical evidence or direct witnesses discovered. All current leads remain unverifiable." He recommended transferring the case to unsolved status for temporary archiving, pending future technological advances or new information. On March 4, 1963, Chief of Police John K. Harris signed document 134/63, formally ending active investigation. All related physical evidence was resealed according to protocol. The stroller, the blanket embroidered with the letter M, hair samples, soil, scene maps, witness statements, and photographs were placed into 3 wooden boxes labeled case hash 62-1047. On each lid was pasted missing child, Bennett, Michael, Springfield, Illinois. The 3 boxes were carried down to the basement evidence vault of the Springfield Police Department and shelved alongside hundreds of other unsolved cases. The investigative team's office was cleared, the wallboard covered with red pins was taken down. After signing the final transfer forms, Delaney stood silently staring at the only photograph still on the desk. Evelyn Bennett holding her son on the front porch, taken just 1 month before the disappearance. He could not shake the feeling of emptiness after hundreds of man-hours and dozens of reports had produced no answer. The Springfield Press ran a brief notice: police suspend active investigation into Bennett baby disappearance. Case moved to unsolved status. The community reacted quietly. No one spoke of it anymore, and life returned to normal. The Bennett family, after numerous meetings with police, no longer expected quick results. Thomas returned to his job at the rail yard, while Evelyn rarely left the house. In the police department, file hash 62-1047 was gray flagged, reserved for inactive cases. Per regulation, after 6 months with no new evidence, it would automatically move to long-term storage. At the end of June, the transfer paperwork was signed, officially removing the Bennett case from the active roster. Delaney wrote his final entry in the duty log. Bennett case, no trace, no clear motive, victim possibly removed from state. Insufficient legal grounds to continue investigation. Recommend archiving file and preserving evidence. He closed the log, signed it, and turned in his temporary FBI access card. In the storage vault, the clerk noted the intake date of June 28, 1963, and placed the wooden boxes on shelf 7, second row from the end, between 2 other missing child cases from 1958 and 1960. The steel door closed, the seal was locked, leaving the files silent under dim fluorescent light. On paper, the Michael Bennett case ended by the book, no evidence, no suspect, no confirmed crime. In reality, it was simply boxed up in 3 cartons and left motionless in the Springfield storage room, where unsolved cases continued to exist beneath a thin layer of dust, forgotten, but never truly closed. In the spring of 1963, just weeks after the Bennett file was reclassified, unsolved Clara Whitmore left Peoria without notifying the hospital where she worked. Her resignation form cited personal relocation. She sold her cream-colored Chevrolet to a local garage for cash, bought a train ticket south, and on April 18 appeared in St. Louis, Missouri, renting a small single-story house on Magnolia Street in a quiet residential area near a church and school. The new neighbors knew her only as a nurse who had moved down from Illinois, living with a young boy she called Mark. People in the area later recalled that she was reserved, polite, rarely socialized, left very early, and returned late. The house had only 2 rooms, windows always curtained, and a small backyard with a few lilies. Clara quickly found work at Mercy Hospital, a large private facility downtown. With her Illinois nursing license and old letters of recommendation, she was easily hired into general internal medicine. On her employment forms, she listed herself as single with 1 son born at home in October 1962. Human Resources did not verify further because the birth certificate looked valid and carried the Peoria County seal. She started part-time day shifts, reserving afternoons for Mark. The child was still too young for neighbors to accurately gauge his age, but everyone assumed he was hers because they shared the same pale blonde hair. Each morning, Clara carried Mark outside for sunlight, then placed him in a stroller by the window when she left for work. She hired a 16-year-old neighbor girl to watch him for a few afternoon hours, with strict instructions never to let anyone near the baby or take him out of the house. At work she wore a necklace with an M pendant tucked under her collar and never removed it. In the 1964 St. Louis civil records, Clara Whitmore appears on the single mother child care subsidy list. The amount was small but enough for formula and supplies. At the hospital, she was disciplined and professional. No one complained, yet few knew her private life. Colleagues described her as always smiling when she spoke of Mark, and occasionally showing a Polaroid photo, a baby in a pale gray sweater, with a gentle smile. No one suspected anything because no one in St. Louis had heard of the Springfield disappearance the previous year. Clara's new life flowed quietly. She worked, came home, shopped at the same grocery store, almost never left the city. The rare letters she sent back to Peoria simply said, "Everything is fine." No one there wrote back. She had no close relatives left. To Missouri authorities, she was just a new resident from another state with a young child. The Peoria birth certificate was the sole legal proof of Mark's existence and thus became an unbreakable shield. The federal system of the era had no interstate record cross-checking mechanism, so no irregularity could be detected. Years later, when former Mercy Hospital colleagues were re-interviewed, a few remembered that Clara reacted oddly whenever she saw a patient or coworker holding a baby. She would stare for a long time, lost in thought, then turn away. During her first year in St. Louis, she dated no one and socialized with no one. On her nights off, she played a small radio, soft music drowning out the wind, and neighbors sometimes heard her quietly singing lullabies. Mark grew quickly and began taking his first steps in the narrow backyard. The sight of the blonde woman walking hand in hand with a little boy around the block gradually became familiar to the neighborhood. In 1964, Clara applied for long-term residency and added Mark Whitmore to her health insurance policy. The forms were accepted without verification. On paper, everything was legal and orderly, as if the child really had been born to Clara in Peoria. After her last shift each week, she often stopped at the photo shop to develop a few new pictures of Mark and stored them in a tin box on her dressing table. She kept no other mementos, no diary, no letters, just the photographs and the forged birth certificate. To neighbors, she was a calm, devoted mother. To coworkers, a diligent, quiet nurse. To the government, a subsidized single mother. Her life was so private that no one had reason to question it. To everyone around her, Clara Whitmore and the boy named Mark were simply an ordinary pair in a big city, starting over after personal difficulties, unaware that behind the quiet house on Magnolia Street lay a story sealed shut by paperwork, stamps, and perfect silences that no administrative agency of the time could penetrate. Mark Whitmore grew up in the little house on Magnolia Street, St. Louis, during the 1960s, when the city still retained the peaceful look of a middle-class working community. He was an obedient, quiet child who clung to his mother. Neighbors saw the two of them almost every day, walking together to the nearby store, Clara never letting go of his hand. When Mark reached preschool age, Clara personally took him to school every morning and picked him up on time, never allowing anyone else to do it. Teachers described him as bright, quick to learn, more interested in observing than in group play. On his enrollment medical form, Clara wrote, "Born at home, no hospital records." The school accepted it because the law, at the time, did not require hospital certification. At regular checkups, Clara stayed by his side and answered for him. Whenever the doctor asked about neonatal history, she simply said, "Perfectly healthy." No one doubted her. Mark truly was healthy, just a bit thin and quiet. In the schoolyard, he usually sat at the back, preferring to draw rather than play with others. Clara monitored his every activity closely and rarely allowed playdates or sleepovers. When invited, she politely declined, saying, "He has night terrors. I don't want to inconvenience anyone." As he grew, Mark became more like his mother, calm and withdrawn. He did well in school, especially in math and music, but never spoke of a father. When teachers asked, he answered, "My dad died a long time ago." The response Clara had taught him from toddlerhood, repeated like a reflex. She never spoke of the past. There were no family photos, no relatives visited. Their house never had guests. Occasionally a coworker would stop by with a birthday gift for Mark, but Clara always met them on the porch, thanked them, and said the boy needed early rest. Inside, everything was neat and simple. Clara's work desk, a small cabinet of medical supplies, a bookshelf with a few old volumes, and the tin box holding Mark's photos from infancy, added to each year, labeled only by month, never by location. Just the child's face growing older. When Mark started elementary school, Clara switched to night shifts so she could be home during the day. She hired an afternoon sitter with instructions never to open drawers or touch the dressing table. The sitter later said Clara always kept one wooden drawer locked and the key on her person. Mark began to notice his mother's constant vigilance. Whenever anyone asked about their family, she deflected and changed the subject to his studies. He grew accustomed to it and learned to stay silent like her. In the neighborhood, people liked the pair for their politeness, but also found them distant. Whenever the church held a festival or neighbors gathered, Clara cited night shifts as an excuse to stay away. She feared crowds, feared anyone touching Mark. He grew up in a quiet world of radio music and his mother's voice. In return, Clara taught him to read early, using library medical books. Mark learned fast and had an excellent memory. At 8, he was placed in the local gifted program. Teachers called him unusually mature, yet sometimes confused when classmates spoke of grandparents or siblings. He had no memories beyond his mother. When he asked about his birth, Clara always smiled and said, "You came to me on an autumn day, no one else was needed." That answer convinced Mark his beginning was as ordinary as any child's. No city office ever questioned their records because everything remained valid on file. The Mark Whitmore birth certificate sat undisturbed like any other. Through the 1970s, as the city expanded and residents came and went, Clara and Mark stayed in the same little house, keeping their guarded routine. She bought nothing new, took no family pictures, just added school uniform photos of her son to the tin box. For Mark, childhood was a calm, repetitive chain of days where every morning he woke to find his mother standing at the window watching the street, and every night he fell asleep to wind through the panes. He sensed nothing strange in that life, never noticed the erased past, only knew that his mother always told him one thing: everything out there can change, but here you are always safe. And to young Mark's mind, that was enough to make the outside world something distant he did not need to understand. Back in Springfield, while Clara and Mark had blended into their new life in St. Louis, Evelyn Bennett continued living in the same small house on South Edwards with her husband. Time did not erase the emptiness, even though outwardly everything appeared normal again. Every morning Thomas still went to the rail yard. Every afternoon Evelyn still brewed coffee. swept the porch, and tended the daisies she had planted when Michael was little. But inside, nothing was the same. After police closed the file, Evelyn kept searching on her own. She cropped the last photo of her son taken before the disappearance, made dozens of copies, and posted them everywhere: library bulletin boards, churches, grocery stores. Beneath each picture she wrote by hand, "Missing October 13, 1962. Any information, please contact Evelyn Bennett." People in town grew used to the sight of the thinner woman with dark circles under her eyes, carefully replacing wind-torn flyers. Around that time, parent support groups for missing children began forming, and in 1965, Evelyn joined Parents of Missing Children, a volunteer network that shared information across states. Every month she mailed them letters with the photo and detailed description. Male, 13 months at disappearance, brown hair, light eyes, small birthmark on left wrist. She hoped someone in another state would recognize him. Whenever a reply came, even just a form letter saying, "No matches found," she kept it, filing everything neatly in a wooden cabinet. Thomas supported her in silence, knowing advice was useless. Years passed, Springfield modernized rapidly, and the old neighborhood found itself in the heart of the growing city. Local papers occasionally mentioned the Bennett disappearance in unsolved cases columns. Each time, Evelyn received a handful of letters from people claiming information, but police checks always revealed hoaxes or mistakes. A man in Iowa sent a photo of a child resembling Michael, only to admit it was his neighbor's son. A woman in Indiana said she had seen a familiar boy in a supermarket, but the age didn't match. Every small hope was crushed. She learned to keep busy yet never let go. Every Sunday morning before church, she stopped at the post office to mail more envelopes containing flyers to out-of-state churches. Her letters always said the same few lines, never bitter, only asking people to please watch for this child. He may be somewhere, still alive. Sometimes charities replied that they would keep the file active, and she thanked them as if it were good news. Thomas spoke little, but at dinner, he sometimes watched her carefully cutting old photos with small scissors, her face cold and focused. He knew he could not pull her away from that belief. In 1970, when local TV stations began airing missing person segments, Evelyn submitted Michael's picture, hoping for airtime, but the case was deemed too old, with no fresh leads. Friends gradually stopped mentioning the subject because Evelyn would only fall silent and change the topic. Still, in their bedroom, Michael's photo remained neatly framed on the nightstand. Every October 13th, she lit a candle and wrote a few lines in a notebook. "How long have you been gone? If you're alive, you would be 10, 15, 20. No one read those lines but her, yet they were the only ritual that helped her endure time. When Thomas transferred to another rail yard, she spent more days alone, volunteering at church fundraisers for other missing child families. Townspeople saw her as a symbol of patience, though few believed the case still had a chance. By the late 1970s, the original investigators had all transferred or retired, leaving only the old file in storage. Evelyn continued sending an annual letter to the police department asking for updates. They always replied politely, "No new information, file remains open." That answer repeated for decades, yet she never stopped asking. Sometimes at night, when the neighborhood was quiet, she opened the drawer, took out her son's picture, and looked at it under the yellow lamp, gently running her fingers along the edge. To the outside world, the disappearance had faded into oblivion, but for Evelyn, it had never ended. She still believed that somewhere, in another town, her child was living under a different name, and as long as she kept searching, fate would one day bring him back, even though the years passed silently, without a single sign that her hope was real. 12 years after the disappearance, in the summer of 1974, while Evelyn was still regularly sending letters and flyers everywhere, a minor incident occurred in a health administration office in Peoria County that no one paid any attention to. There, an archivist named Margaret Dwyer was assigned to review old birth records in preparation for the switch to the new Illinois state forms. Her job was simple: check the format, re-stamp valid records, and flag those that needed a doctor's signature or court verification. In the drawer containing 1962 home birth records, she came across a certificate with an incorrectly formatted header, the printed text shifted to the right, the county seal blurred and misplaced. It was the birth certificate of Mark Whitmore, filed November 20, 1962, mother listed as Clara Whitmore. Under the new rules, such records were supposed to be verified for authenticity, but the sheer volume meant Margaret simply marked the top right corner in red pen with needs verification and set it aside. She planned to check it later after finishing another batch, but at that exact moment, the office received urgent orders to move all home birth records to temporary storage for an internal audit. The files were tied by month and sent down to the basement of the administration building. The needs verification note on Mark Whitmore's certificate ended up buried among hundreds of other pages, unseen by anyone. When the audit ended, all the old records were sealed in boxes and transferred to the state archives in Bloomington. There was no procedure requiring staff to report temporarily flagged records. With no electronic database or indexing, everything was done manually. Illinois had just begun piloting citizen data digitization, but only for birth records after 1970. Older records like Mark Whitmore's remained on paper, never entered into the system. In her report to superiors, Margaret wrote only preliminary review completed, no serious irregularities found. No one asked for details, thus Mark's defective certificate continued to exist legally, legitimizing the identity of a child who had never actually been born in Peoria. At the same time, police agencies across the state still operated independently, with no central population or missing persons database. The Vital Records Office, the Department of Health, and the Springfield Police Department had no information-sharing channels. Had a linked system existed, a simple cross-check of Mark Whitmore's birth date against Michael Bennett's disappearance date would have immediately raised red flags. But in 1974, that was technologically impossible. In Springfield, the Bennett case had been moved to long-term storage, occasionally mentioned on the state's cold case list, but never reopened due to lack of new leads. Communication between agencies relied solely on paper memos and landline phones. When the Peoria records were shipped out, no one in administration realized that a red pen mark in the corner of one sheet could have been case-breaking evidence. At the Bloomington archives, thousands of records were stacked in cardboard boxes, labeled by month, and marked processed. No staff were assigned to reread old documents. Margaret quit the following year to get married, taking with her only a vague memory of the dozens of forms she had reviewed. The name Mark Whitmore quickly faded from her mind. The certificate itself, its red note now barely legible, lay sealed in humid conditions, its edges beginning to yellow. Years later, when Illinois finally rolled out a centralized database, the old paper records were still not digitized due to lack of manpower. Old administrative errors were considered too minor to matter. A 1975 administrative reform summary contained one brief line: pre-existing birth data requires no cross-checking. Preserve as is. No one knew that this seemingly routine decision preserved a flaw dating back to 1962 and turned it into legal proof of a false identity. Had someone looked more closely, or had the needs verification flag been escalated? A simple question: why did a woman named Clara Whitmore file a Peoria birth certificate with no matching hospital record? Might have opened a new investigative path, but that never happened. The system simply did what it was designed to do: store, not question. And so the defective certificate continued to exist as a lawful Illinois citizen, stamped, numbered, and boxed away in 1974. Waiting many more years for someone with reason to reopen it, by which time the only person who had ever seen it first had likely forgotten she once held a crucial piece of a decades-long missing child case. In the fall of 1987, St. Louis entered an early cold October, and in the small house on Magnolia Street, Clara Whitmore spent the final weeks of her life in silence. Late diagnosed lung cancer had forced her to stop working at Mercy Hospital, where she had been employed for over 20 years. Close colleagues occasionally visited with flowers and kind words, but Clara spoke to almost no one except her son. Mark was 25 then, had just finished an electronics technician course, and still lived with his mother. He had no idea her illness was terminal until the family doctor told him bluntly that Clara had little time left. In her final days, she clung to old habits, waking early, making tea, turning on the radio for classical music, then sitting by the window, looking out at the small garden. As her strength failed, Mark took leave from work to care for her. In the evenings, he read the newspaper beside her bed. She simply listened, occasionally asking small things like, "Did you eat lunch today, or is it raining outside?" The already quiet house grew even more hushed. Neighbors noticed the windows always closed, only the yellow glow of a lamp spilling out each night. Clara refused hospitalization, saying she wanted to remain in the home where she had raised her son. In early November, her condition worsened. The doctor came to administer pain relief, and Mark sat holding her hand. She passed away on a calm morning without pain, her face wearing the same serene expression it always had. The funeral was modest, held at the nearby church, attended by only a few co-workers and neighbors. Mark handled all the arrangements, then returned to an empty house that suddenly felt alien. While sorting belongings, he began cleaning out drawers and organizing his mother's clothes and papers. In the vanity drawer, he found a rusty old tin box tied with a dark ribbon. Thinking it held family photos, he opened it. Inside were dozens of old photographs arranged chronologically. Most were of him from infancy through adulthood, the annual pictures his mother always took. But at the very bottom, among the yellowed prints, were a few different ones. Scenes of a park with wooden benches, a lake and rows of elm trees in autumn. On the edge of one photo, handwritten in now blurred blue ink, were the words Springfield, 1962. Mark stared for a long time, trying to remember if they had ever visited there, but no memory surfaced. He had never heard his mother mention Springfield, and he had never seen these pictures before. One showed a blonde woman standing with her back to the camera, a stroller in front of her. The rest were quiet shots of the lake. No other people appeared, only a distant feeling. He turned them over, no further notes. Besides the photos, the tin contained a small envelope with various old receipts and his mother's expired hospital ID. There was also a twice-folded document bearing the Peoria County seal, birth certificate. Mark Whitmore, born October 10, 1962. He had seen copies of it many times and thought nothing of it. But when he placed it next to the park photo marked Springfield, 1962, he felt a momentary confusion. The printed birth year matched the date written on the picture. He couldn't see the connection and assumed his mother must have lived in Springfield once and taken souvenir photos. Mark carefully repacked everything, put the tin back in the drawer, and continued cleaning the house. In the following days, he donated most of his mother's belongings to the church, keeping only the tin and a few pictures of her when she was young. To him, the Springfield images were simply part of a past his mother had never shared, a private matter he had no reason to probe further. Life went on. He tidied the house, repaired things, removed the smell of medicine and dampness. The house on Magnolia Street now contained only him and the silence his mother had left behind. Occasionally, while reorganizing photos, he would again see the words Springfield, 1962, and wonder why she had kept those seemingly meaningless pictures for so many years. But then he would fold them away, thinking they were probably just the hazy memories of a woman who had endured losses he would never fully understand. And so the photographs remained quietly stored, along with questions no one had asked, in the house that Clara Whitmore had left forever, taking with her a secret buried beneath layers of time and the calm she had carefully maintained. In the winter of 1998, heavy snow blanketed the streets of Springfield, a city much changed since Michael Bennett vanished 36 years earlier. Evelyn Bennett, now 70, lived alone in the old house on South Edward Street after Thomas died a few years before. She kept her routine up at 6 coffee radio news, sometimes gazing at the winter garden where only dried daisies remained. Her son's photograph still sat on the nightstand, its wooden frame faded but dusted daily. Evelyn never left Springfield, partly because of her health, partly because deep down she feared that if she went far away, her son might return and not find her. In her final years, she continued writing to missing children organizations, even though her trembling hands made the letters slant. The messages were short and nearly identical, asking whether any cases matched Michael's description and requesting that his file remain active. Her only niece, Sarah McCall, daughter of Evelyn's younger sister, was the one relative who still visited, helping clean, buy medicine, and talk. Sarah, then in her mid-30s and a high school teacher, was the only family member who still cared about the long-forgotten case. Each visit she found her aunt at the dining table, surrounded by brown envelopes, old flyers, and a notebook filled with names, addresses, and mailing dates. Evelyn had never stopped recording everything. She no longer remembered her son's exact age, but still believed somewhere he was alive. That year her health declined rapidly. Persistent coughing worried Sarah, who repeatedly tried to get her to a doctor, but Evelyn refused, saying it was just a cold. In early December, she collapsed at home. Neighbors found her and called an ambulance to Memorial Hospital. Doctors diagnosed heart failure and lung complications. Evelyn spent 2 weeks in the hospital, lucid most of the time, still asking Sarah whether the mail had been checked and if any organizations had replied. When Sarah said no, Evelyn only smiled and said, "That's all right. Maybe the letters will come next week." She died on a cold morning without another word. The funeral was simple, held at the local church, attended by a few relatives, old neighbors, and volunteers from the groups she had worked with. Afterward, Sarah was tasked with settling Evelyn's estate and papers. In the small house, she found a locked wooden chest in the bedroom. Inside was everything Evelyn had kept about the case: copies of police reports, newspaper clippings, correspondence with authorities, and photographs of Michael. There were also the flyers Evelyn had printed, their corners worn, the ink faded. Sarah sat for hours at the table turning pages, reading letters filled with hope and despair from a woman who had never given up the fragile belief that her son lived. She found unsent Christmas cards addressed to the National Center for Missing Children in Washington, D.C., each containing a scrawled note: "Please keep my son Michael Alice Bennett's file active, case hash 621047. I still believe." When Sarah closed the chest, she understood. It held not just papers, but an entire lifetime of waiting preserved in wood and dust. She decided to throw nothing away, organized everything neatly, and stored it in her own attic. From then on, everything that remained of the Bennett case belonged to her: photos, letters, notes, all preserved as the final legacy of a woman who had spent nearly half a century searching in vain. Outside, Springfield's winter remained quiet. The street where Evelyn once posted her son's picture was now lined with new houses, and no one remembered who the little boy had been. But in that small room, late daylight fell on the old framed photo, reflecting the face of a child smiling innocently, as if time had never passed, and Evelyn's decades of waiting had not truly ended. The Illinois State Central Archives are housed in the old 1930s administration building on North 8th Street in Springfield, expanded over the decades, and contain more than 200,000 criminal, civil, and internal police records. The vast basement holds rows of steel shelves reaching the ceiling, filled with sealed wooden crates and cardboard boxes, hand-labeled with case numbers, years, and types. In the summer of 2002, a periodic inventory program began in preparation for digitization. Young officers rotated through the basement to check box conditions and update catalogs. Among them was rookie officer Daniel Morris, age 25, recently transferred from Chicago, assigned to the 1950-1970 Unsolved Crime section. Daniel walked the aisles taking notes, photographing faded labels, and replacing rotted ties on damaged boxes. The work was monotonous but required care, and sometimes he paused to skim old files out of curiosity. One June morning, while reviewing the B aisle, he noticed a wooden box much smaller than the rest, thick with dust. Its label barely legible, #621047, missing child, Bennett, Michael, Springfield, Illinois. The number meant no more to him than any other, but the box's age caught his eye. The seal was intact. The leather strap rotted, yet the red wax stamp of the Springfield Police Department remained unbroken, proof it had never been opened since archiving. Procedure required only noting its condition, photographing it, and entering the data. Curiosity, however, led him to loosen the lid just a few inches to peek inside. Inside lay a brown folder, sealed envelopes, a few black and white photos, and a small folded map of the scene. Everything was neatly arranged, the paper yellowed. On the cover, handwritten, Investigator, Lieutenant F. Delaney. Case, #621047. Daniel opened to the first page, the investigation summary, victim, Michael Bennett. Male, 13 months, disappeared Washington Park, Springfield, October 13, 1962. Presumed, child abduction. He read on about the suspected woman, the light-colored Chevrolet, and witnesses. The last entry was dated March 4, 1963. Signed by the chief, closed, unsolved. Every line was dense purple ink and shaky ballpoint, giving the feeling that time had frozen. Daniel sat on the floor and flipped through scene photos and grainy images of the park, lake, benches, stroller. A chill ran through him when he realized the file had lain untouched for 40 years. Regulations forbade breaking evidence seals, but he carefully noted in the inventory log, box, #621047, good condition, complete documentation, seal intact. As he started to close the lid, a thin sheet slipped out from the middle of the folder. A note in Investigator Delaney's small blue ink handwriting, no hard evidence, primary suspect Clara Whitmore, nurse, Peoria. Suspected emotional motive abduction, victim not recovered. At the bottom, note, if future forensic technology becomes available, preserve hair sample. Daniel smiled faintly, impressed by the foresight of an investigator 4 decades earlier, then replaced the sheet. He closed the box, retied the leather strap, and attached a new external label for easier reference. In the electronic catalog he added, file intact, contains physical evidence, store in dry conditions. That afternoon, when he turned in his report, he mentioned case #621047, noting it was one of the oldest fully preserved missing child cases. His supervisor only nodded and said, "Leave it, we have no order to reopen." Daniel understood the archive held thousands of similar cases, most destined to stay sealed forever. Old cases were reopened only at court or family request, and this file's last listed relative, Evelyn Bennett, had died in 1998, according to vital records. With no one left to ask, the case would never leave the shelf. He stood for a moment before the endless rows of boxes, each number a sealed story. As he left the basement, he glanced back once more at the old wooden box labeled #621047, wondering what had become of the child inside, or if it was only the remnant of a tragedy no one remembered. Then he turned off the lights, the iron door closed, and the space returned to silence, broken only by the steady hum of ventilation fans. Box #621047 sank back into darkness, among thousands of others, a new layer of dust slowly settling on the lid. In the electronic system, the entry read simply, "Condition good, retain," a cold line of data replacing hundreds of pages about loss, error, and vanished lives. No one knew that Daniel's brief opening of the lid and reading of a few lines that morning had inadvertently saved the file from destruction 3 years later, when any box lacking a new inventory mark was discarded. To him it had been just another long morning, and an old name on yellowed paper he would soon forget among the endless codes in the Illinois State Archive. In the spring of 2015, more than half a century after the Springfield disappearance, Sarah McCall, Evelyn Bennett's granddaughter, lived in Chicago and taught history at a high school. For weekend entertainment, she signed up for a personal DNA test through the platform Find Your Roots. She had heard many colleagues talk about discovering distant relatives or ancestral origins through genetic testing, and since almost no one was left in her own family, Sarah wanted to see if she could trace the branch of her family that had once emigrated from Europe. The test kit arrived by mail. She followed the instructions, sent her saliva sample back to the company's lab in California. Everything seemed routine until 2 months later, when she received the results email. The first part showed the usual genetic ancestry breakdown, mostly Northern European, nothing unusual. But at the bottom of the page, a new section appeared, DNA relative match detected. 99.84% shared ancestry with user ID, MW8724. Location Missouri, USA. The numbers stopped her cold. According to Find Your Roots algorithm, that level of similarity only occurred between immediate blood relatives, parent-child, siblings, or aunt/uncle-niece/nephew. Sarah had never known of any relatives in Missouri, and certainly no one named Whitmore, which was the surname shown in the user ID. She clicked into the profile, only the name Mark Whitmore, birth year 1962. No specific address, just St. Louis area. The bio was blank, except for a short line. Retired electronics technician, interested in genealogy. Sarah read the 99.84% figure 3 times. A chill spread through her. She remembered the years of listening to Aunt Evelyn talk about the baby who vanished in 1962. Michael Bennett, 13 months old, an unsolved case. Mark Whitmore's listed birthday, October 10, 1962. The coincidence made her heart race. Reason told her it could be random chance, but the unease wouldn't leave. She printed the results, then dug out the old wooden box she had kept since Evelyn died. Inside, the last line on the police note read, "Victim, Michael Bennett, born September 1961. Missing October 13, 1962. Sarah stared at the 2 dates, only weeks apart. That night, she logged back into Find Your Roots and sent a contact request to user Mark Whitmore with a polite message. "Hello, the system says, we share a very close genetic relationship. I'm Sarah McCall, and I live in Chicago. You might be a distant relative. I'd love to talk." After sending it, she sat motionless in front of the screen, unsure what she had just set in motion. 3 days later, Mark replied briefly, "Hi Sarah. I was surprised by the result too. I don't have any relatives in Illinois, but it's interesting. Maybe our ancestors crossed paths. I was born in Missouri. My mother was a nurse and passed away a long time ago." The words, "my mother was a nurse," sent a shiver down her spine. An eerie match with the name Clara Whitmore in the old file. She forced herself to stay calm, responded neutrally, and asked a few more questions about his family, birthplace, and childhood. Mark answered politely, but vaguely, no hospital birth record. His mother said he was born at home. No other relatives. The story lined up almost perfectly with everything Sarah knew from Evelyn's documents. Unable to explain it herself, she sent the full genetic data to an independent lab for verification. 2 weeks later, the result came back identical. 99.84% close blood relationship, consistent with an aunt-niece/nephew pattern. At the same time, Find Your Roots, per its agreement with the state forensic agency, automatically forwarded an alert to the Illinois Cold Case Review System, a database created in 2012 to screen for DNA matches with old missing persons cases. The automated report read, "High probability genetic link detected between user Sarah McCall and user Mark Whitmore." The notice went straight to the Illinois State Police Cold Case Coordination Office. One morning in early June, the officer reviewing the daily data updates noticed case hash 62-1047, flagged under potential match, the first time in over 50 years. He pulled up the electronic record and saw the Bennett file still intact, thanks to the 2002 inventory. Delaney's final note about hair sample to be preserved was still visible in the scanned file. Per procedure, the system flagged for review and notified the state cold case unit. Because of one casual weekend action by a Chicago high school teacher, a file everyone thought had been asleep for half a century began to move again. Sarah had no idea her uploaded data was being traced backward through forensic archives. That night, when she received an email from Find Your Roots saying the system is verifying your results with our forensic partner, she assumed it was just routine confirmation. Meanwhile, in Springfield, an administrative chain reaction had begun. Case hash 62-1047 was activated on the review list. The evidence was requested for re-examination, and the name Mark Whitmore, Louis, Missouri, appeared for the first time in the Illinois State Police system as a potential link to the oldest missing child case in their archives. No one yet realized that a few DNA percentages on a computer screen had reopened a door sealed for more than half a century, triggered by the simple act of a woman preserving her aunt's legacy, and a seemingly meaningless data match had become the first signal reconnecting two ends of a story torn apart in 1962. In June 2015, after the Illinois Cold Case Review System flagged a DNA match related to case hash 62-1047, state headquarters held an emergency meeting to verify the facts. The file was assigned to Detective Helen Morris, 41, a veteran of the cold case unit who had solved several old disappearances using genetic technology. Helen read the initial report, which stated clearly, genetic match between a direct descendant of the victim and an individual living in Missouri named Mark Whitmore. She had never heard of the Bennett case before, but when she opened the archive data, the words missing child, Springfield, Illinois, 1962 caught her eye. She requested access to the state evidence vault that still held unopened boxes from the previous century. 2 days later, she arrived at the storage facility on North 8th Street, the same place where, 13 years earlier, a young officer named Daniel Morris had re-inventoried the file. The warehouse had since been renovated. Temperature and humidity controls now met preservation standards. The archivist led her to shelf B7, where the old wooden box labeled hash 62-1047 sat exactly where it had been left. The leather strap and seal had been replaced during the 2002 maintenance, but the original red wax seal was still visible. Helen put on gloves, carefully broke the seal, and lifted the lid. A faint smell of old paper and damp wood drifted out. Inside, besides the paper file and crime scene photos, were 5 sealed evidence envelopes numbered 01 to 05. She checked the inventory list, hash 01, blonde hair sample, hash 02, soil sample, hash 03, embroidered blanket with letter M, hash 04, witness statements, hash 05, scene photographs. Everything matched Lieutenant Delaney's 1963 log. She cautiously opened envelope hash 01. Inside a small glass vial wrapped in foil were several short blonde hairs. The handwritten label on the vial read collected from stroller handle, Washington Park, the 13th of October 1962. Under a magnifying glass, the hairs looked intact, barely discolored. The accompanying forensic technician confirmed the sample was still viable for mitochondrial DNA extraction if properly handled. Helen noted, primary evidence in stable condition, suitable for analysis. She examined the rest. The blanket was stained, but the embroidered M still legible. The soil in its jar dry and undisturbed, the 35 mm scene photos sharp. She lingered over the picture of the wooden bench by the lake, where the empty stroller had been found, then sighed softly. Nearly 60 years had passed. Everyone involved was probably gone. Only these objects remained as witnesses. She ordered formal transfer of the evidence from storage to the Illinois State Forensic Lab in Joliet for DNA testing. Before leaving the vault, Helen skimmed the paper file and saw Delaney's thin handwriting in green ink. If future technology allows evidence testing, preserve the hair sample. The note felt like a message across time. She resealed the envelopes, signed the chain of custody form, and resealed the entire box before it was loaded into the transport van. That afternoon, back at state headquarters, she drafted the case reactivation report and attached a request for renewed DNA analysis. In the summary, she wrote, Case #62-1047, reactivated per Illinois Cold Case Review Request. Objective: confirm genetic relationship between missing victim Michael Bennett and individual Mark Whitmore. Copies went to the State Bureau of Investigation and the Central Forensic Institute. That night, Helen sat alone in her office reading every page she had copied from the old file. The paper was frayed, the purple ink faded, but Delaney's investigative structure was clear. Scene description, witness list, suspect Clara Whitmore. The surname made her pause. Whitmore, the same as the man in Missouri. Everything seemed to be reconnecting after more than half a century. She turned to the last page, case closed, unsolved, and no additional evidence recovered. She looked out the window. Springfield was quiet tonight, not much different from the old photographs. She wondered whether the investigators before her had ever imagined that one day technology would let them continue the journey their era had been forced to abandon. Before leaving the office, Helen placed the copied file on her desk, stuck a red active label on it, and officially reopened the case. Beneath her signature, she added a short note. Based on DNA match alert, evidence item 01, blonde hair sample, confirmed intact. Sent for analysis June 16, 2015. When she turned off the lights, only the blue glow from the computer screen illuminated the words, Case #62-1047, reactivated, marking the moment the old disappearance stepped out of storage darkness and back into a world of questions waiting to be answered. The Illinois State Forensic Lab in Joliet received the evidence box for Case #62-1047 on the morning of June 17, 2015, under direct supervision of Detective Helen Morris. Technicians began mitochondrial DNA testing, the method used to extract mtDNA sequences from decades-old evidence, standard for cold cases spanning many years. The blonde hairs were removed from the glass vial and processed in a sterile clean room. Remaining root material was dissolved with special enzymes. Since no living tissue was present, mtDNA was the only viable option. The process took nearly 2 weeks, each hair dissolved, centrifuged, then amplified to produce a readable sequence. Helen observed from the viewing room, recording every parameter. Preliminary reports confirmed the sample was uncontaminated and belonged to a female, matching Lieutenant Delaney's original 1963 suspicion that the hair likely came from the suspect. Helen asked the team to continue by cross-referencing the mtDNA against medical and forensic databases in Missouri, where suspect Clara Whitmore had lived before dying in 1987. Clara's records were kept at Mercy Hospital in St. Louis, where she had worked. In storage, the lab located a paraffin-embedded lung tissue sample from a biopsy performed before her death from cancer. That sample had sat in hospital pathology for nearly 30 years, unintentionally becoming the only surviving genetic evidence of Clara Whitmore. In early July, the team obtained a court order authorizing retrieval and comparison. Both samples were processed in parallel, one from hair collected in 1962, one from tissue archived in 1987. After 3 straight days of sequencing, the mtDNA report was printed, 99.93% probability of identity, an absolute match in forensic genetics. The hair found on the stroller handle in Washington Park on October 13, 1962, belonged to Clara Whitmore, RN, Mercy Hospital, St. Louis, Missouri. The result was cross-checked by the FBI lab at Quantico and confirmed. Helen received the final report at 9 a.m. The bold heading read, Match confirmed. Sample ID 62-1047-01, donor ID MO 1987 Clara Whitmore. She read it over and over, feeling the words bridge half a century between a small park in Springfield in 1962 and a cold hospital room in St. Louis in 1987. The report was forwarded with administrative records. Clara Whitmore, born 1935 in Peoria, nurse, never married, died November 11, 1987. Of terminal lung cancer, buried at Calvary Cemetery, St. Louis, Missouri. Vital records confirmed her death was properly registered, no heirs. The note, "No surviving relatives," stamped in red, told Helen the only suspect had been dead for nearly 30 years. She sat quietly, looking at two photographs side by side, the black and white image of Clara from the old file, and the copied death certificate. The genetic match confirmed what the previous generation could only suspect: the woman in the light-colored coat, seen in Washington Park in 1962, was Clara Whitmore. Helen called state headquarters to report the preliminary findings, her voice calm but firm. Bennett case. Hair matches suspect Clara Whitmore. Suspect deceased. On the other end of the line, the unit commander was silent for several seconds before replying. Document the entire process. We'll move the case to the phase of establishing the link with the individual in Missouri. Helen hung up, leaned back in her chair, a mix of satisfaction and heaviness settling over her. The case had turned, but the person who held the final answers could no longer be questioned. In the internal report sent that afternoon, she wrote, July 3, 2015, mitochondrial DNA analysis of evidence, 62-1047-01 completed. Matches tissue sample from Clara Whitmore. Suspect confirmed deceased. Recommend shifting investigation to victim status determination. In the final note she added, the only surviving physical evidence from 1962 has proven Lieutenant Delaney's hypothesis. This match validates the professional judgment of the previous generation. As Helen left the lab, a light rain was falling in Joliet. Raindrops on the car window reflected streetlights. In the trunk, the old wooden evidence box from the Bennett case was resealed. Its mission finally fulfilled, the one Lieutenant Delaney had instructed in 1963. If future testing technology exists, preserve the sample. 53 years later, that instruction had been carried out. After DNA testing confirmed the 1962 blonde hair belonged to Clara Whitmore, Detective Helen Morris began the next phase, reconstructing the woman's complete movements around the time of the abduction to establish exact timing and method. At the Illinois State Police Investigation Office, she spread out a map of central Illinois and marked 3 key locations: Peoria, where Clara lived and worked; Springfield, the disappearance scene; St. Louis, where she later settled. Using archived records and administrative data, Helen and her team rebuilt the timeline. Peoria Memorial Hospital personnel files showed Clara started as a nurse in 1959, took 3 months off in mid-1961, after a miscarriage, then returned to work in early 1962. The October 1962 shift log had her name crossed out for the morning shifts of the 13th and 14th, with no official replacement. A marginal note from the charge nurse read, Whitmore called in sick, no certificate submitted. That record, combined with 1962 employment files, proved she was absent exactly when Michael Bennett vanished. Helen moved on to transportation data. The state archives provided copies of toll booth ledgers from highways 4 and 55, the routes connecting Peoria to Springfield. An entry for October 13, 1962, at 10:42 a.m., listed a light-colored Chevrolet with a license plate beginning East 47, matching the plate registered to Clara. The data survived because of an early automated vehicle count trial, though there were no photos. The record was sufficient to place her car heading toward Springfield that morning. A second piece of evidence came from fuel purchase records at a Lincoln County gas station 8 miles from Washington Park, where a witness had reported seeing a young woman with a baby. An old carbon copy receipt read Chevy 68 gallons, cash, signed CW. When Helen enlarged the image, the signature matched Clara's handwriting from hospital files. Taken together, the travel route became clear. Clara left Peoria around 8 a.m. on October 13th, took Route 24 to Route 4, arrived in Springfield around 10:30 a.m., and appeared in Washington Park shortly thereafter. Michael's disappearance occurred between 10:10 and 10:15 a.m., perfectly aligned with her recorded presence. Around 11 a.m., she left Springfield heading south on Route 55 and was back in Peoria that afternoon, matching neighbor statements that she returned after several days away with an unfamiliar baby. Helen presented the chain of evidence in a summary report and drew a red route on the map connecting the three cities, Peoria, Springfield, St. Louis. To clarify the later period, she queried Missouri administrative records. In 1963, Clara purchased a small house in St. Louis with cash, no mortgage. The address matched the childhood home, later listed by Mark Whitmore, aka Michael Bennett. Mercy Hospital records confirmed she started working there in June 1963, 8 months after the disappearance. Every data point cross-checked without contradiction. Notably, Peoria Memorial's final payroll entry for Clara was October 10, 1962. There were no time cards for the next 3 weeks until she returned November 5. The gap between leaving work and the disappearance was critical evidence of premeditation. Helen queried federal tax records and found Clara reported no income for the final quarter of 1962, then filed anew in Missouri in 1963 from a completely different address. The rapid relocation and job change showed deliberate intent to start a new life immediately after leaving Peoria. Her only contact with the old hospital was a short letter stating moving for personal reasons. Helen added this to the detailed timeline: 1961, miscarriage. 1962, leaves job, travels to Springfield. 1963, appears in St. Louis with child. 1987, dies of lung cancer. A seamless sequence with no gaps. For further verification, she visited the Springfield newspaper archive. An article published October 16, 1962, in the Springfield Daily described the disappearance of a brown-haired 13-month-old boy and mentioned a woman in a light-colored coat seen near the scene. Helen realized Clara must have seen the article after returning to Peoria, yet remained silent. She wrote in the report, "All administrative, travel, and timing evidence aligns perfectly with the hypothesis that suspect Whitmore was present in Springfield at the exact time of the crime. Immediate relocation afterward confirms preparation." When compiling the final file, Helen placed 3 photographs side by side: Clara in 1960 wearing her Peoria nurse uniform, her 1963 St. Louis residency photo, and the 1987 funeral portrait. Despite the years, the same stern expression, cold face and determined eyes remained. She stamped the final conclusion: timeline confirms Clara Whitmore's travel route, Peoria, Springfield, St. Louis. Data matches victim disappearance date exactly. Sole suspect Clara Whitmore, deceased. As she saved the file and turned off the screen, it felt as though the map of time had just closed its circle, joining fragments 3 generations of investigators had spent more than half a century trying to assemble. After completing the report, reconstructing Clara Whitmore's journey, Detective Helen Morris decided the next step was to make direct contact with the man who was likely the victim in the case, Mark Whitmore, residing in the suburbs of St. Louis, Missouri. She submitted an official request to the Missouri State Police for coordination in verifying his identity, attaching a case summary and the DNA results from the Find Your Roots database. 3 days later, she received confirmation that Mark Whitmore, age 53, retired, former electronics technician, no criminal record, lived alone in a private home on Laclade Station Road. Helen called ahead, introduced herself and her rank, and explained that she was investigating an old missing person file from Illinois that might be connected to him. Mark's voice on the line was slow and guarded, tinged with curiosity. When she mentioned the name Clara Whitmore, he went silent for several seconds before answering. "That was my mother. But she passed away a long time ago. What's this about?" Helen briefly explained that genetic database analysis had revealed an unusual match between Mark and a Chicago woman named Sarah McCall, the granddaughter of Evelyn Bennett, mother of a child who disappeared in Springfield in 1962. She stressed that this was not an accusation, only a verification process to clarify the genetic connection. On the other end of the line, Mark let out a long breath, his voice turning hoarse. "I've heard the name Springfield before. It was written on some of my mother's old photos, but I never knew what it meant." Sensing his hesitation in his tone, Helen suggested meeting in person to discuss it further. 2 days later, she drove to St. Louis, carrying copies of the file, her investigation credentials, and the test results. Mark's house was small and tidy, located in a quiet residential neighborhood. The silver-haired, tall man greeted her politely, but cautiously welcomed her. They sat in the living room, where an old photograph of Clara still hung on the wall. Helen laid out the entire investigation process, from the DNA match to the discovery that the stored hair sample belonged to Clara, and explained that the current goal was to determine whether Mark was in fact Michael Bennett, the child who vanished in 1962. She placed in front of him a copy of the Mark Whitmore birth certificate filed in Peoria that November, pointing out that the document was improperly formatted and lacked medical verification. Mark stared at the paper for a long time before saying, "I know my mother told me I was born at home. At least that's what she always said. But I never found any hospital records. When she died, all I found was this certificate and some strange photos with Springfield written on them." He stood, went into the next room, and returned with a faded old tin box. Helen immediately recognized it as matching the description of the document box Clara had kept for decades. Inside were old photographs, receipts, and the original birth certificate. He handed them to her without another word. Helen examined the photos one by one, scenes of a park, wooden benches, a calm lake, all taken in Washington Park in 1962. One of them bore the handwritten note, Springfield, 1962. She gently set the picture down, feeling as though every piece had finally fallen into place. She asked, "Did she ever tell you anything about the time before you moved to St. Louis?" Mark shook his head. "No, she always avoided talking about the past. All I know is that she worked as a nurse in Peoria, and then moved here when I was little." Helen took notes, then explained that the agency wished to conduct an official comparative DNA test between his sample and descendants of Evelyn Bennett to confirm the blood relationship. She presented the consent form, making clear he had the right to refuse. Mark looked at the paper for a moment, then signed. "I don't know where this will lead," he said quietly, "but maybe it's time I knew the truth." Helen collected a buccal swab according to protocol, sealed it in a tube labeled Subject M. Whitmore 2015. Before leaving, she asked if she could borrow the tin box to make copies. Mark nodded, saying he wanted the originals back afterward. As Helen got into her car, he was still standing in the doorway, watching her drive away. She knew that moment worked the first time in more than half a century that someone might finally answer the question the Bennett family had waited for. That afternoon, back at the office, Helen entered the new data into the system and sent the DNA sample to the Joliet Forensic Lab with the note, "Reference sample M. Whitmore, verification of genetic relationship to Bennett descendants. Testing per legal authentication protocol." In the report to her superiors, she summarized, "Mark Whitmore provided improperly formatted birth certificate with no supporting medical records. States, adoptive mother, never explained his origins. Voluntary participation in DNA comparison, confirmed." When Helen signed at the bottom, the line, "Request for DNA verification," subject Mark Whitmore officially opened the final verification phase of the Bennett case. Outside, a light rain fell on the parking lot, reflecting the lights of the police building, where a 1962 file had just been pulled from the darkness, carrying the fragile hope that a story long thought closed might finally receive its answer. Mark Whitmore's DNA sample was transported to the Illinois State Forensic Lab in Joliet under cold chain conditions, accompanied by the consent form witnessed by Detective Helen Morris and a Missouri state notary. On July 8, 2015, technicians began the comparison process against the genetic profile of Sarah McCall, direct descendant of Evelyn Bennett, already stored in the Illinois Cold Case Review database. Because the time gap between samples was not excessive and quality was high, the team used STR analysis combined with mitochondrial DNA sequencing. Gene segments were amplified and compared locus by locus according to National CODIS standards. Helen, was present for the start of the process, observing through the lab's glass wall and noting in her log, Bennett, Whitmore comparison sample, verification of potential blood relationship. The lab ran continuously for 5 days to rule out error. On July 13th, the preliminary report appeared on screen. 15/15 loci matched perfectly, with a 99.87% probability of close blood relationship. That percentage can only occur between individuals related directly, specifically, aunt, niece, or grandmother's grandchild. Helen read the bolded result line, match confirmed, genetic consistency, indicates shared maternal line. The forensic experts confirmed, Mark Whitmore and Sarah McCall share the same mitochondrial DNA sequence passed down from Evelyn Bennett, proving that Mark is Michael Bennett, the child who disappeared in 1962. The report underwent secondary review by the FBI lab at Quantico to ensure legal admissibility before release. The final conclusion stated, probability of direct maternal relation 99.87%, positive identification. When Helen received the first printed copy, she sat for a long time in the small conference room, staring at a sheet of paper filled only with numbers and signatures, fully feeling the historical weight it carried. After 53 years, Springfield's unsolved child disappearance finally had an answer through technology the previous generation could never have imagined. She immediately contacted State Command, forwarding the report and summary. Subject Mark Whitmore confirmed as Michael Bennett, born 1961, missing since October 1962. Simultaneously, an internal email went to the Illinois State Police and Cold Case Review Unit. Within an hour, the information reached internal communications. Bennett case. Victim identity established via DNA testing. Helen left the lab and stood in the long, brightly lit hallway, filled with a mixture of relief and awe. Everything that remained of the case, the old blanket, the wooden box, and the hair sample, had now fulfilled its purpose. On the official report she signed, the final line read, Case #62-1047, positive identification achieved through genetic evidence. She thought of Lieutenant Delaney, who in 1963 had written in the file, if future technology allows evidence testing, the hair sample must be preserved. Half a century later, that wish had come true. To establish legal certainty, Helen continued gathering administrative confirmations. The Peoria Vital Records Office confirmed the 1962 Mark Whitmore birth certificate was invalid, improperly formatted, and filed by Clara Whitmore herself. The Missouri Vital Records Bureau added Clara's residency records from 1963, showing a child of matching birth year. Every administrative and genetic data point led to the same conclusion. Helen's consolidated report, submitted July 16, 2015, stated clearly, Mark Whitmore's DNA matches 99.87%, with Evelyn Bennett descendant profile, confirming shared maternal lineage. Based on these results and administrative records, identity affirmed Mark Whitmore = Michael Bennett. Once approved, the case status officially changed from unsolved to solved by DNA identification. Helen printed 2 copies, one for State Archives, one for Cold Case Review, and affixed a red label to the folder cover, Identified, July 2015. That night, she drove back to Springfield and stopped at Washington Park. The lake was still there, the elm trees still stood silently, but the area around the water had been repaved. She sat on a bench near the spot marked in the old photos and wrote briefly in her notebook. October 13, 1962, missing, July 13, 2015, confirmed. Michael Bennett has come home. The lights from the lake's edge reflected on the page. The DNA numbers now carried human meaning instead of cold data. In the final report to State Command, Helen added an off-protocol note, the previous generation left us the clues, and technology did the rest. Victim identity confirmed by indisputable evidence. Conclusion, victim Michael Bennett, missing Springfield 1962, currently living as Mark Whitmore in Missouri. Status, alive. Identified. When she signed and stamped it, Those words officially closed one of Illinois' longest-running missing person cases, ending more than 50 years of waiting and turning a string of DNA digits into the final answer for everyone who had never stopped searching. On July 20, 2015, the Illinois State Police held an official press conference at headquarters in Springfield to announce the resolution of case hash 62-1047, one of the oldest missing person files in state history. The press room was packed with reporters, local and national media, and retired officers who had worked the case decades earlier. On the podium stood Detective Helen Morris beside the state police superintendent and a representative from the Cold Case Review Unit. After months of verification and comparison, they were ready to release the final conclusion. As camera flashes filled the room, the superintendent began calmly, 53 years after the disappearance of toddler Michael Bennett, we can confirm the case has been solved through DNA technology. He paused, glancing at the thin file on the lectern. DNA analysis proves that Mark Whitmore, resident of Missouri, is Michael Bennett, the child who vanished from Washington Park, Springfield, in 1962. The room fell silent for several seconds before the clicking of cameras and murmurs erupted. Helen summarized the investigation timeline from the Find Your Roots system, flagging the match between Evelyn Bennett's descendant and Mark Whitmore to the retesting of the hair sample preserved for half a century. She spoke slowly, emphasizing that the foresight of the 1963 investigator in preserving evidence made today's truth possible. This case is the clearest proof of the value of preserving records and cooperation across investigative generations, she said. Behind them on the screen, old images appeared: Washington Park in 1962, the stroller, and a black and white photo of baby Michael Bennett, followed by a current picture of the silver-haired, calm-faced Mark Whitmore, sitting in the front row beside his niece Sarah McCall. The room watched as Helen stepped back from the microphone, yielding to the superintendent. He read the final conclusion: case hash 62-1047, status changed from unsolved to solved by DNA identification. Victim Michael Bennett confirmed alive. Suspect Clara Whitmore, Peoria nurse, deceased 1987. No criminal elements remain. After the announcement, Bennett family representatives were invited to speak. Sarah McCall approached the microphone, voice trembling. I don't know what to say, except thank you. My great-aunt Evelyn Bennett spent her entire life searching for this answer. If she were still alive, she would be smiling today, knowing her son has finally been found. She turned and took Mark's hand. He nodded slightly, eyes wet. When reporters asked how he felt, Mark answered slowly, I lived my whole life not knowing who I really was. Today I know I have a family, a name and a past. I'm grateful for that, even if it came late. His simple words brought silence to the room. Helen stood in the back, watching, fully aware of the gravity of the moment. All the months spent poring over records, the dust in the archives, Delaney's handwritten notes, everything had led to this instant. News spread quickly. Headlines swept the country. Cold case solved. After 53 years, missing Illinois child found alive, through DNA match. DNA technology rewrites history. Within hours, the Bennett case became the new symbol of solving cold cases through genetic technology. The state office received hundreds of calls from other agencies asking about the process, especially long-term evidence preservation. The press conference lasted nearly 2 hours, ending with the superintendent handing Mark and Sarah certified copies of the amended Illinois identity document, stating, Michael Bennett, born September 5, 1961, missing October 13, 1962. Identity confirmed July 20, 2015. As they held the paper, camera flashes lit the room once more. Helen approached, shook their hands, and said quietly, the most important thing is that the story now has an ending. Mark responded only with a tired but relieved smile. When the event ended, reporters surrounded Helen, asking what kept her persistent with this file. She answered briefly, some cases don't need a crime to be solved, they only need the truth. Outside, midday sunlight covered the headquarters parking lot. Helen looked through the window and saw Mark and Sarah leaving together, carrying the small document box containing Evelyn's old photos, the picture of baby Michael, and the brand new certificate. She knew that from this day forward, the Bennett file would no longer be just a number in storage, but proof of what her entire profession believed. No matter how long it takes, the truth waits to be named. Immediately after the press conference announcing the Bennett case resolution, Detective Helen Morris returned to the Cold Case Review office to complete her operational review report. She understood that identifying Michael Bennett did not merely close a case, it exposed decades of systemic flaws in investigation, storage, and data sharing across the state of Illinois. In the quiet office, Helen opened the electronic file and began the summary, case hash 62-1047, post-resolution analysis. She divided the document into 3 sections: administrative failures that caused the case to go cold, the fortunate factors that allowed its revival, and recommendations for procedural reform. In the first section, she detailed every identified shortcoming. The opening line read, 1. Absence of inter-county data linkage, 1960-1980. That gap allowed the forged Mark Whitmore birth certificate to go unnoticed, despite being filed only weeks after the abduction. She cited a 1974 Peoria County Clerk report that flagged the formatting error, but had no mechanism to cross-report to Springfield police. Next, 2. Manual storage without periodic retrieval protocol. File hash 62-1047 sat untouched for over 40 years and escaped destruction only because of a random 2002 inventory. Had Daniel Morris not accidentally reopened the box and relabeled it, the case could have been purged. Third error. 3. No linkage between medical and forensic databases. Clara Whitmore's tissue sample sat in Mercy Hospital archives since 1987, yet remained unknown until Helen requested it nearly 30 years later. Routine medical forensic data sharing could have enabled matching decades earlier. Helen paused, poured coffee, then continued with the second section, factors leading to resolution. She wrote that the Bennett case succeeded largely due to consumer genetic genealogy platforms, specifically Find Your Roots, where citizens voluntarily submit samples. That random submission triggered the Illinois Cold Case Review Alert. Technology and human persistence. She typed slowly. Compensated for the failures of an earlier era. In the final section, Helen presented reform proposals. First, establish an integrated state archive system, a unified digitized repository linking criminal, civil, and medical records with unique case identifiers tied directly to the national DNA database. Second, create a cross-county alert mechanism that would automatically flag administrative documents matching missing person or suspect profiles. Had it existed in 1962, the Mark Whitmore birth certificate would have been instantly cross-checked against the Bennett case. Third, she stressed long-term evidence preservation, stating, the single piece of evidence that broke the case, hair sample 01, was retained for over half a century only because of investigator Delaney's note. Mandate a minimum 75-year retention period for missing person cases and untested biological evidence. Additionally, she recommended incorporating evidence preservation and legacy file digitization into investigator training curricula. In the conclusion she wrote, if the Bennett case teaches us anything, it is this time is not the enemy of justice, outdated systems are. She presented the report to the Command Review Board at the end of July. The state police superintendent praised the proposals, stating they could become the framework for statewide archival reform. After the meeting, Helen left the room feeling she had closed the final chapter of a long journey. She stood in the hallway, looking out the window at the late afternoon light streaming through the glass, thinking of Lieutenant Delaney, of everyone who had worked with ink and paper files, and of one small strand of hair that traveled 50 years to return the truth. In the short internal media summary she wrote, the greatest lesson of the Bennett case is not about crime, but about how we learn not to repeat the silence of the system. When Helen hit save, the final line appeared, Illinois State Police. Case hash 62-1047, final operational review completed, July 2015. On the morning of early August 2015, more than 2 weeks after the DNA results were announced, and the Bennett case was officially closed on paper, Mark Whitmore drove from St. Louis back to Springfield, the city where he was born, but had never remembered. The summer city blazed with sunlight, new streets mixed with rows of old houses, and Washington Park, where it all began, still sat unchanged in the heart of downtown. The state police had arranged a private meeting at headquarters to hand over the evidence and allow the Bennett family to officially reunite. In the small conference room, soft light filtered through the window. A round table held several case files, framed photographs, and an old wooden box. Detective Helen Morris waited with Sarah McCall and 2 distant Bennett relatives, the only ones left from that generation. When Mark walked in, the air in the room seemed to slow. He wore a light-colored shirt and walked with a slight awkwardness. Sarah stood first, stepped forward, took his hand, her eyes filled with emotion and caution. "I guess you're my uncle," she said softly. Mark nodded, answering in a choked voice. "I think so too." They sat down. Helen opened the meeting with a few brief words. "Today we're not talking about the case anymore. Everything has been confirmed, and what remains is for the family to find each other again." She opened the lid of the wooden box and took out several pieces of evidence that had been restored after declassification. The blanket, embroidered with the letter M, a few crime scene photos, and copies of the case file. Helen gently pushed the blanket toward Mark and said quietly, "This is the only thing left that belonged to you from 1962. It was found next to the stroller in the park." Mark stared at the blanket for a long time, then reached out and touched the frayed edge where the men was still intact, only slightly faded. He said nothing, just nodded faintly. Sarah opened her bag and took out an old framed photograph of Evelyn Bennett, the aunt who had spent her entire life searching for her son. She placed it on the table next to the blanket. "This is your mother," she said, her voice breaking. "She never stopped looking for you." Mark looked at the woman in the photo, hair neatly pinned up, kind eyes, gentle smile, then turned away, his hands trembling. "I used to wonder why my mother never talked about the past," he said quietly. "Now I understand. She must have carried a story whose missing piece was me." Helen watched them both and wrote the final lines in the file. August 4, 2015. Bennett family and Mark Whitmore officially receive evidence from case hash 62-1047. When she signed her name, those words marked the end of an investigation that had lasted more than half a century. After the handover, Sarah took Mark to visit the old Bennett family home on South Edward Street. The house had been sold to someone else, but the new owners allowed them inside. The small living room still had the old fireplace where Michael's picture once sat. Mark stood silently, looking around, trying to imagine the place that had once been his home. Sarah told him about Aunt Evelyn, about the years she plastered photos of her son all over town, wrote letters across the country, and never believed the baby was gone. "She lived until the end still waiting," Sarah said, her voice thick. "If she could see today, I think she would finally be at peace." Mark was quiet, answering only with a slow nod. Afterward, they went together to Washington Park. Helen came along, carrying the case file to turn it over to the state archives after the small ceremony. On the grass by the lake, where the wooden benches had been replaced, Helen pointed to the spot shown in the old black and white photo. "Right here," she said, "is where it all began." Mark looked in that direction, his gaze distant. He bent down, placed the blanket with the M on the bench, held it for a few seconds, then let go. Sarah stood beside him, clutching Evelyn's framed photo. A gentle breeze blew across, rippling the lake's surface. No one spoke, there was only the sound of wind and birds. When they left the park, Helen submitted the case file to the state office. By regulation, all evidence had been declassified and returned to the family, except the original documents, which were digitized for permanent storage. She signed the final report, writing clearly, "Case hash 62-1047, evidence returned to family. Status, closed solved." The old wooden box, after more than half a century in storage, was finally handed back to the person it belonged to. When Mark accepted it, he bowed his head in thanks. "I never thought I'd touch the past," he said, his voice breaking. "But now I know the past doesn't disappear, it just waits to be found," Helen answered softly. "And today, you found it." That afternoon, they went together to the city cemetery, where Evelyn and Thomas Bennett lay side by side. Sarah placed the photograph and white daisies. Mark laid the small blanket on the grave. He knelt, whispered something only he could hear, then stood up, his eyes calm. As they left the cemetery, the sun was low, late daylight, stretching across the old headstones. Through the car window, Helen watched the two of them walking together, one carrying the wooden box, the other holding the framed photo, quietly walking away. In her notebook, the final line for the Bennett case read, "Evidence returned, family reunited, file closed." After 53 years, the truth has come home to those who deserve to know it. And so, in the twilight of Springfield, a case once thought buried by time was fully closed, not with police sirens, but with the meaningful silence of two people who had finally found each other. After the reunion in Springfield, Mark Whitmore returned to St. Louis in silence. He declined all interviews, turned off his phone, and sent a short thank you letter to the Illinois State Police for helping him learn the truth. "No one ever told me in my whole life." The media kept trying to reach him. Local papers ran series after series with headlines like "Child Missing for 53 Years Found Alive." But Mark never appeared again. He spent the first days afterward rearranging the house on Magnolia Street, the only world he and Clara had ever known. The old photo of her still hung on the wall. But for the first time, he looked at it differently. Now the picture no longer brought guilt or fear, only closure. In his journal, he wrote a few short lines. "She raised me with a mother's love, even though it began with a mistake. I can't hate her. I can only go on living with this truth." A few days later, he drove to Calvary Cemetery, where Clara was buried. The simple headstone read only Clara Whitmore, 1935, 1987. Mark stood there a long time, then placed a single white daisy, the flower Sarah said Evelyn loved most. He said nothing, only bowed his head slightly, then left. From then on, he lived more quietly, rarely going out, spending most of his time reading and gardening. Occasionally, Sarah would call. They talked briefly, gently, like relatives who had known each other forever. In those conversations, Mark rarely mentioned the past. He was more interested in Sarah's teaching, in the Bennett family memories he had never known. "I feel like someone rereading an unfinished book," he told her over the phone. "Some chapters can't be changed, but at least I now know where I fit in it." Meanwhile, in Springfield, Sarah and the remaining Bennett relatives held a memorial service for Evelyn at First Baptist Church, where she had once done charity work. On October 13th, the exact anniversary of the disappearance, they chose to remember not only Michael, but Evelyn, the mother who never stopped searching. The service was simple: a few rows of chairs, Evelyn's photo in the center of a white flower altar, beside a small sign that read "In loving memory of Evelyn Bennett, 1928, 1998. She never stopped believing." Sarah read a short passage from the notebook her aunt had left behind. "How long have you been gone? If you're still alive, you would be 10, 15, 20. Her voice broke as she reached the end, where Evelyn had written, "Even if one day no one remembers, I will still believe you're out there somewhere." No one in the church said anything more. There was only the soft sound of a piano and light streaming through the stained glass windows onto the photograph. After the service, Sarah wrote to Mark, telling him it had gone beautifully and that she had placed his photo, now Michael Bennett, next to Evelyn's on the altar. Mark didn't reply right away. A few weeks later, she received a postcard from St. Louis with only the words, "I read what she wrote. Thank you for letting me come home," in her memory. On the back was a picture of Washington Park, where everything began, with a handwritten note, "Springfield, 2015. Sarah kept the postcard in Evelyn's old document box, next to the letters from years ago, as another piece of the journey now complete. The media moved on after a few weeks. The Bennett story faded, making room for new headlines. But for those involved, the echoes remained. Helen Morris continued her work in the cold case unit, but sometimes, passing the old storage room, she would stop in front of shelf B7, where box #62 1047 once sat, now empty, except for a faded label reading "Retrieved. Family Custody." For her, the Bennett case was not just a closed file, but proof that justice can be slow yet never loses the trail. That fall, golden leaves covered Washington Park. One morning Sarah went there carrying a small bouquet. On the new wooden bench, she found the blanket with the embroidered neatly folded, placed there by someone. There was no note, only a light breeze across the lake. She sat down, stayed quiet a long time, then smiled. Evelyn had once written, "If my child is still alive, a mother will know, even if no one says it." And now, more than half a century later, those words had come true. Louis, Mark, looked out the window of the old house as afternoon light stretched across the wooden floor and whispered, as if answering a voice in his memory, "I'm home, Mom." In October 2015, when the Illinois State Police finished archiving the Bennett file under closed solved, Detective Helen Morris received a notice from the Administrative Department of Mercy Hospital in St. Louis. An old records clerk, while recataloging 1987 medical files, had discovered an unmarked, sealed envelope with faded handwriting, to be opened only if someone ever asks. The envelope had been stored between two of Clara Whitmore's medical folders with the same archive number. The outside was dated November 2, 1987, just 9 days before Clara died. Helen immediately went to St. Louis to verify it. In the hospital's old administration office, the supervisor handed her the small yellowed envelope. The seal was faint, but C. Whitmore was still legible in the corner. Following procedure, Helen documented the unsealing in the presence of a forensic representative. Inside were 2 folded sheets, written in blue ink, with neat, feminine handwriting. The first line read, "If someone finds this letter, I am probably gone. I write not to be forgiven, but to say what I could never say while alive." Helen read on, feeling as though she were hearing the long-dead woman speak through every word. "My name is Clara Whitmore. In 1961, I was pregnant but lost the baby in the 7th month. The doctor said I could never have children again. I was a nurse in Peoria then, watching women leave every day with their babies while I went home to an empty apartment. I began to pray, thinking God had forgotten me. In the fall of 1962, I visited an old friend in Springfield, and in Washington Park, I saw a young woman pushing a stroller. The baby smiled at me. I don't know why I stopped. Everything afterward happened like a blind dream. I thought if I just held him for a moment, the emptiness inside me would go away. But when the woman turned away, I couldn't put the baby back. I took him with me. I told myself it was fate, that I wasn't stealing. I was only receiving the child life owed me. I named him Mark. I raised him, cared for him, loved him as my own. But every time I looked into his eyes, I knew I was lying. I lived in fear for years, afraid someone would knock on the door and ask what I had done. When I saw the news about the missing child, I shook with terror. I wanted to bring him back, but I didn't have the courage. I knew I would be arrested, and he would be torn away again. I chose silence. I am sorry to that mother, Evelyn Bennett, for the pain I caused. If you ever read this, please know your son grew up surrounded by love, not violence or lies. I cannot undo my wrong, but I hope when the truth comes out, people will understand I did not act out of malice, but because loss had blinded me. I kept the photo of Springfield's park all my life as a reminder that some mistakes cannot be fixed. The letter ended with the signature Clara Whitmore and a final line. Mark was the only light in my life, but I know that light was never truly mine. Helen finished reading and sat in silence for a long time. She requested photographs of the original, resealed it, and prepared transfer paperwork to the Illinois State Archives. In the supplemental report she wrote, October 12, 2015, handwritten document by suspect Clara Whitmore, discovered in Mercy Hospital records, confirming 1962 child abduction. Letter reveals emotional motive, no evidence of intent to harm. The letter was scanned, encrypted, and added to case file hash 62-1047 under supplementary evidence. In the closing notes, Helen added, "This evidence confirms the maternal abduction." Emotional motive hypothesis proposed in the 1963 Delaney report. Leaving the hospital, Helen held the copy of the letter. Afternoon sunlight through the glass highlighted the slanted, heavy yet controlled handwriting, as if the writer had been trying to stay calm amid torment. She thought of Mark, Sarah, and Evelyn, 3 lives bound by one moment of error. That evening, Helen forwarded copies to the Cold Case Review Office and added to the official file, letter of confession located and archived. Case hash 62-1047 remains closed. Motive confirmed, emotional loss leading to abduction. In the quiet office, she placed the copy inside the folder, then closed the cabinet. A soft click sounded as the safe locked. The true period at the end of a story that began more than 50 years earlier, with a baby's smile in a park, and ended with the belated confession of a woman who spent her life loving, regretting, and waiting to be forgiven, if only in her final written words. In March 2016, 6 months after Clara Whitmore's letter was found and the Bennett case was fully closed, the state of Illinois officially passed the Long-Term Forensic Records and Evidence Management Improvement Act, commonly called by the press the Bennett Act. It was a direct result of the operational review report Detective Helen Morris drafted after the case ended. That report, presented to the State Judicial Committee, drew strong attention for exposing the systemic failures that had allowed the Bennett case to be forgotten for over half a century. In May of the same year, the governor signed an order establishing the Illinois Cold Case DNA Registry, the first centralized database in the United States dedicated solely to missing persons, unsolved homicide, and unidentified remains cases. The system allowed storage and cross-referencing of civilian DNA samples, physical evidence, and administrative records from every county in the state, directly linked to the federal CODIS network. At the launch ceremony, the state police superintendent said, "If this system had existed in 1962, the Bennett case would not have taken 53 years for an answer." Helen was invited to join the advisory team, developing procedures for the new registry. Throughout the summer, she worked with data engineers, forensic experts, and legal advisors to set standards for cold case management. Step by step, the mistakes of the Bennett case became specific regulations. All biological evidence, even if untested, must be preserved for a minimum of 75 years. Any administrative record with suspicious elements, birth, death, relocation, must be automatically linked and flagged in an inter-county alert system. The registry also required annual random audits of 5% of stored files to ensure data integrity. In the implementation report, Helen wrote, "No case is truly cold as long as evidence still exists. A single hair, a drop of blood, or a forgotten number can reopen the door to justice." By year's end, the Joliet State Forensic Lab was upgraded with high-capacity cryogenic storage to preserve evidence across generations. Every evidence box received a QR code linked directly to the central registry, containing all digitized information. The act also mandated that when an investigator closes a file, 2 signatures are required, one from the lead detective, one from a forensic representative, to prevent misfiling or improper destruction. The rule began in 2017 and quickly became the new standard statewide. Helen was invited to speak at the National Conference of the Cold Case Investigators Association in Denver. In her address, she said, "The Bennett case is not a story of guilt, it is a lesson in the endurance of evidence. If one small hair can survive 50 years to provide an answer, we must never take any piece of information lightly." After the conference, many other states used Illinois' model to create their own DNA registries, turning the Bennett Act into a national template. The press at the time called it one of the most important advances in modern forensic science. Within the state police, Helen continued, leading the long-term evidence management division. She ordered construction of new climate-controlled storage facilities and training for preservation specialists. One of the new rooms was named the Delaney Room in honor of Lieutenant Frank Delaney, who in 1963 had sealed the hair sample with the note preserved for the future. Helen had a copy of that note hung at the entrance as a reminder for every future generation. Each year, the registry published performance reports, number of cases reopened, numbers solved through DNA matches, and lists of decades-old evidence still preserved. In the first report released in 2018, the Bennett case appeared on the opening page under the title Case That Changed the System. Below it was a photo of the old wooden box and a short caption, Evidence Preserved from 1962, identified in 2015, inspired systemic reform. The story became required training material for new investigators, teaching that investigation is not only about finding perpetrators, but also about protecting truth for the years to come. Helen received the state's Medal of Honor for her contributions to reform. Accepting the award, she said I only finished the work those before me started. I just carried on what they didn't live to complete. After the ceremony, she went to Washington Park, now renovated with a small memorial area for unsolved cases. In the middle of the stone walkway stood a bronze plaque that read, Cold Doesn't Mean Forgotten. Dedicated to the memory of Michael Bennett, Helen placed a white flower there and stood quietly looking at the calm lake. In the evening breeze, she thought of the people who had walked through this story, Clara, Evelyn, Mark, Sarah, each carrying a piece of the truth. And now, from those mistakes, Illinois had built a system so that other truths would never again be buried. In August 2016, exactly 1 year after Illinois officially recognized the Bennett case as solved by DNA identification, Detective Helen Morris completed the final summary report and initiated the procedure to transfer file hash 62-1047 into permanent archives. The report, over 300 pages long, included the complete investigative data, forensic testing procedures, witness statements, a copy of Clara Whitmore's letter, and the administrative reforms that followed the case. She spent 3 full weeks in the cold case review office, reviewing every item, ensuring every detail matched the original records. On her computer screen, the title line read clearly, Final Documentation, Case File Hash 62-1047, Michael Bennett. The report's introduction stated, Date initiated October 13, 1962. Date closed, July 20, 2015. Status, closed. In the conclusion section, she wrote in an objective tone, but could not fully hide her emotion. The Bennett case marks a turning point in the history of criminal investigation in the state of Illinois. From a file forgotten for more than 50 years, it has become a symbol of the value of evidence preservation and genetic technology. Helen reread every line before signing her name and applying the electronic forensic agency seal with her authentication code. When the validation process was complete, the system displayed the message approved for digital archive. She clicked confirm, and the data was instantly encrypted and backed up to the Illinois Archives Data Center in Bloomington, the electronic storage facility that holds millions of the state's criminal case files. A hard copy was printed, bound into a volume with a gray hardcover embossed with the words Case, hash 62-1047, Bennett, Michael. Helen carefully placed the printed copy into an archive box, labeled it, and together with the storage staff, carried it down to the basement of headquarters. The storage room was now climate-controlled, with gleaming steel shelves. Every file was numbered and tagged with a QR code linked directly to the electronic system. She stood silently in front of shelf B7, the spot where Lieutenant Delaney's old wooden box had once sat, now replaced by the new box clearly marked, closed. Helen signed the transfer receipt. The final line under final disposition read, All physical and digital evidence secured, digitized and archived. Case permanently closed. As the archivist locked the vault door, the mechanical sound echoed dryly, but to her it was the sound of complete closure. On her way back to the office, Helen paused in front of the small memorial plaque in the main hallway that listed solved cold cases. Beneath the heading "Reopened and Solved Through DNA," the name Michael Bennett had been newly engraved in bright metal, with the note identified 2015, closed 2016. She lightly touched it. The metal felt cold and smooth. In all her years on the job, she had read thousands of files, but this was the first case that made her believe justice is not only about catching criminals, it is about returning the story to those who deserve to know the truth. At the end of month internal briefing, she presented a summary of the Bennett case as part of a training report. On the projection screen, she displayed images of the old wooden box, Clara's letter, and the embroidered blanket with the letter M. "This is why we preserve things," she told the younger detectives. "Because one day, someone will need what we leave behind." After the meeting, she received a thank you letter from the Illinois Department of Justice, confirming that the Bennett file had become a model case for the National Forensic Training Program. The press still occasionally mentioned the case in articles about evidence storage reform and DNA investigation, calling it the case that waited for science. Helen no longer gave interviews. She felt the story was complete. At the end of the month, she returned alone to Washington Park, the original crime scene, and the place where everything had finally come full circle. The lake was calm that morning. The new bench still bore its bronze plaque, in memory of Evelyn Bennett and all who waited. Helen sat down, opened her notebook, and wrote the final line. Bennett case archived, status, closed, solved. Evidence preserved, lesson remembered. She closed the notebook, looked at the sunlight reflecting on the water, and thought of the people tied to this case. The mother who waited, the woman burdened by guilt, the son who reclaimed his identity, and the investigators who now existed only through faded purple ink. As she left the park, she stopped once more at the entrance gate and looked at the small Washington Park sign. Beneath it, someone, perhaps Sarah or Mark, had placed a single white daisy. She smiled, stepped onto the street, feeling a lightness as though she herself had just closed not only a case, but an entire chapter of history. That night, in her darkened office, she logged into the system one last time to check. On the screen, the case status read, #62-1047, closed, solved, archived. Helen watched the blinking cursor, then pressed log out. The screen faded to black, reflecting only her face, and in that moment, all the noise of the job, all the unanswered questions, simply dissolved. Outside, Springfield's lights came on, their glow spilling through the office window and falling across the desk, where the duplicate Bennett file lay open to its final page. Justice does not fade with time, only waits to be rediscovered. She closed the file, placed it in the drawer, and turned off the light. The door shut with a soft click, confirming that after more than half a century, the Michael Bennett case had finally become part of history, not a tragedy any longer, but testimony to human perseverance in the pursuit of truth. In December 2016, 1 year after the Bennett file was officially placed in the Illinois archives, the Illinois State Police released a comprehensive final report on the case. A document of more than 400 pages titled Case #62-1047, Legacy of the Bennett Investigation. The report opened with a concise statistic: 53 years, 4 generations of investigators, 2 generations of genetic technology, 1 single truth. From 1962 to 2015, the Bennett file had passed through every era of criminal investigation, from ink, paper, and photographic negatives to digital databases and DNA testing. Lieutenant Frank Delaney, the man who first sealed the hair sample, died in 1989, never knowing that his note, should technology ever exist to test this, would prove prophetic. Nearly half a century later, that very sample, combined with a random DNA database match between 2 people in different states, restarted the entire case. In the professional evaluation section, the report stated, "The Bennett case demonstrates the power of physical evidence and the critical importance of preservation. A single small item can cross decades to answer questions that seemed forever silenced." Helen Morris was credited with reopening the file and completing the identification, while Daniel Morris, the young officer in 2002, was honored for the inventory action that inadvertently saved the file from destruction. The report also analyzed the investigation across 4 generations. The first, led by Delaney, relied on manual methods. The second merely maintained storage without supporting technology. The third restarted archiving and standardized procedures. And the fourth, the era of DNA and digital data, finally solved the case completely. Each phase was a piece reflecting the evolution of forensic investigation. At the summary conference in Springfield, the state police chief declared, "The Bennett case is not just the story of a child found after 53 years, it is a roadmap for the future of justice." On the large screen they showed the numbers: 1 case 53 years, 9,417 total investigative hours, 16 successive investigators, 3,200 pages of documentation, 2 generations of genetic technology, and 1 final test that closed everything. The middle section of the report focused on the case's impact on the state's investigative system. After the Bennett Act was passed in 2016, the number of reopened cold cases rose 42%, with 17 solved through matches in the new DNA registry. The Evidence Preservation Facility in Joliet now operated to international ISO standards and became a model for 12 other states. Illinois police academies added the Bennett case study to their official curriculum on archiving and old case investigation. In training classes, new officers learned the entire process from Delaney collecting the sample, the administrative error that caused the file to be lost, to the reactivation through DNA technology and the 2015 identification. The material was regarded as the ethical standard of the profession, emphasizing that every detail, no matter how small, can be the key. The report's conclusion highlighted the new philosophy born from the case: justice has no expiration date. The Illinois State Police formally incorporated the principle, no statute of limitation for truth, into the mission statement of its cold case division. The report also addressed the human dimension: 3 parallel lives, Evelyn Bennett, the mother who searched for her son until her dying day; Clara Whitmore, the woman scarred by loss and haunted by her own actions; and Mark Whitmore, the child who lived between 2 identities. A footnote read, "None of them were winners or losers, all were witnesses to time." From a societal perspective, the Bennett case became a research topic in universities studying criminal psychology and justice law. Sociologists assessed that it reflected both sides of human nature, fragility and resilience. The press and academia called it the case that humanized cold justice, the case that made the public see that behind every cold file stands a family, a life, and a memory that never closed. Helen received the first copy of the report at the end of December. She read it cover to cover, pausing at the final section. Legacy. It stated, "The Bennett case proves that investigation does not end when people grow tired, only when evidence no longer exists. And evidence, if properly preserved, never dies." Below that, her name appeared with a note, Detective Helen Morris. Reopened case hash 62-1047. Identified through DNA, 2015. Helen said nothing. She simply closed the document and placed it on her desk beside a copy of Clara's letter and a photograph of Washington Park. That year, at the state's year-end ceremony, she was awarded the Meritorious Service Award. In her short acceptance speech, she said only, "I didn't solve this case alone. It was solved by a strand of hair, a wooden box, an old note, and people who never gave up." The entire auditorium rose in applause. In the front row, Sarah McCall quietly cried, clutching a framed photo of Aunt Evelyn. Mark was not present, but he sent a letter of congratulations that read, "Thank you for bringing me back to the name my mother always called me." The final Illinois State Police report ended with a simple line, Case hash 62-1047, Michael Bennett, closed, solved, remembered. Beneath it was the red seal of the Illinois State Police, dated December 30th, 2016. The day the case was officially entered into investigative history, as proof that sometimes justice does not need to race against time. It only needs someone patient enough to wait for it to come back. The story of the Michael Bennett case, a child missing for 53 years, found through modern DNA, is not only the tragedy of three people, Evelyn, Clara, and Mark, but also a mirror reflecting American society today, where technology, justice, and human compassion intersect in unexpected ways. In a vast country where tens of thousands of people go missing every year, the Bennett case reminds us that every piece of data, no matter how small, carries profound human value, and technology only truly matters when it is guided by patience and responsibility. Evelyn Bennett, the mother who spent her entire life searching for her son, represents the power of faith, the force that keeps justice alive even when people believe time has erased everything. Clara Whitmore, the woman who made a terrible mistake out of grief, shows us another side, that fragility, when left unhealed, can lead to tragedy, and society needs mental health support systems, not just to prevent crime, but to save lost souls. And Mark, the child who grew up under a false identity, reminds us that truth, even when it arrives late, can still set a person free from the past. In today's United States, where DNA databases, child protection programs, and cold case organizations are stronger than ever, the lesson of the Bennett case remains fully relevant. Preserve, do not discard, the evidence, the memories, and the seemingly tiny fragments, because they may one day deliver justice to the future. And above all, in a society that always moves fast, this story reminds us that truth never grows old. It only needs someone persistent enough to keep searching. Thank you for following the story to the end, where truth was found after more than half a century, thanks to faith and justice that never sleeps. Please subscribe to the channel so we can continue exploring cases thought to be buried in the past, but still waiting to be told in the next video.